Hello and welcome to From Serfdom to Serfdom, Russia's Emancipation and Soviet Collectivization. What is emancipation? What is freedom? In 1861, Tsar Alexander II of Russia freed the serfs, some 23 million Russians living in degrees of bondage to the land and to their lord. In a famous speech anticipating the emancipation, the Tsar declared, "The present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for the time when it starts to abolish itself from below." Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in America, another top-down revolution that would lead to the eventual freedom of black slaves, drew inspiration from the Russian example, contributing perhaps to the West's long-established misapprehension of Russia, the condition of its people, and its backwardness. Conversely, Russia's Emancipation Proclamation occurred at a time when the perception of Russia's exceptionalism vis-à-vis the West and Europe was strong. The 19th century was a contest between the conservative Slavophiles and the Westernizers, a fact even more pertinent to consider when Marxism itself was a Western import with Russian characteristics. Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism, the engine of Russia's October Revolution and later Soviet collectivization of farmland, amounted perhaps to a new serfdom, the erosion and elimination of emancipation. This conflict over ideologies bleeds into our understanding of serfdom itself. Serfdom is an intellectual holdover from French and later Marxist analysis. The overcoming of serfdom, as judged by the Marxist metrics, is a vital element in class struggle, and understanding history as economic determinism, the succeeding system of class systems. Serfdom will be replaced by capitalism, will be replaced by socialism, will be replaced by communism, etc. However, the first so-called serfdom to exist in Western Europe, according to the Marxists, did so in the High Middle Ages in Western Europe. The second serfdom in Eastern Europe and Tsarist Russia existed from the 16th century. But what of a third serfdom, a serfdom of the 20th century? The idea of a Soviet serfdom is a supreme irony. It's an inversion of the official Soviet interpretation of history of the past, Marxist theory judged against the results of Marxism. The Russian experience of so-called serfdom should be judged, therefore, on its own terms. This is not a narrative of peasant revolution. The various examples of serf rebellions, Cossack rebellions, most notably the Pugachev rebellion of the 1770s, will feature little in this story. It is instead a narrative of the revolution against the aristocrat, against the landowner, against the kulak, the eventual triumph of bureaucracy, indeed how all Russia's regimes struggled with that concept, obfuscating, dissembling, ultimately to disguise reality. In Russia, the agrarian archetype is an Eden on the steppe. It had broad appeal across the political spectrum. The peasant community, or the mir, was viewed by some as the soul of Russia. The Tsars in their last decades attempted to broaden this connection by appealing directly over the heads of intermediaries, to establish an immediacy between the little father, the Tsar, and the peasant, the most loyal of his imperial subjects. Stalin arguably destroyed the basis of communal Russia, despite his elevation of the concept in his official theory, in the fact that he subordinated agriculture to his 5-year plan, the proletarian revolution of industry in Russia's cities. Russia's story of emancipation to collectivization is a tragic cycle. At best, emancipation was a confused experiment in individualism versus communal reform, a desire for paradise, for purification. In emancipation, we are dealing with the unique social environment of Russia and the political justifications for serfdom, post-serfdom, and collectivization, a false dawn, the failure and inversion of conservative and liberal hopes, and, I would argue, socialist expectations. Beyond any ideological conceit, the story of emancipation is that of defining the peasant's relationship to the state, not freedom from the state. It is a frame that exists around Tsarism, autocracy, in all its manifestations, from Ivan the Terrible to Stalin, the so-called Red Tsar. Coming with this holdover from the Westernizers versus the Slavophiles, and the idea that this word serf could in fact be interpreted. It's possible that this was all, to some extent, a French import. Reading from the historian Alessandro Stanziani, and as with everything, all the links to the sources I use are found in the description. In 1921, so this was during the time of the Russian Civil War, where Lenin was beginning to reach a certain period of ascendancy, which would later confirm the creation of the Soviet Union, Marc Bloch, the famous French historian, warned against the use by historians of the word serf. Indeed, the expression serf of the glebe, for reference, glebe is like a parochial community or a parish. Bloch showed in particular that the notion was absent in the Middle Ages. It was, on the contrary, only widely used after 1748, was popularized by a French theorist and political philosopher, Montesquieu, in his Spirit of Laws. In fact, this idea is, and the anti-medievalism which is inherent in this concept is actually enticing enough that I may cover this in a separate topic later on. But from the view of the expression, the so-called serf of the glebe, the serf of the parish, it was basically to stylize a feudal system and place it in opposition to an equally stylized economic liberal system. In other words, it's easy to gloss over and say that Marxists have invented this form of economic understanding of succeeding systems and creating a dialectic whereby one has to overcome the other in order to drive the momentum of history, but in fact this preceded Marxism by 100 years. It was a staple of the Enlightenment, and I would argue why this attack on feudalism, attack on serfdom, became more of an ideological credo during the French Revolution as opposed to railing against anything that actually existed. Ever since, medieval studies have adopted this conclusion. Indeed, the chronology of this intellectual genealogy is striking. We see criticisms of guilds, serfdom, and slavery all hardened during the 1750s. When Montesquieu published The Spirit of Laws, it was soon followed by the first volumes of the Encyclopedia. In these works, serfdom of absolutist and medieval Europe was contrasted with the free labour of Enlightenment Europe. For example, the Abbot de Morelli took up these themes in 1755 and condemned both ancient serfdom and modern forms of slavery, both in the colonies and Russia. In other words, right from the inception point of really coming up with this word, serfdom, and applying a moral category to economic relations between the lord and the peasant and the state, these were coinciding with criticisms against black slavery at the same time. So when modern historians, I would think, overdo comparative studies and trying to relate all of these things together, so-called backward societies and Russian serfdom and slavery, it really actually begins with the creation of the concept of a serf. So with that understood, how do we come to a Russian serfdom? What does it mean to be a serf in Russia? Russian rules never spoke of serfs, but rather aimed to identify people entitled to transmit immovable property. In fact, Russian and Western historiography, the writing of history, considers the so-called krepostno pravo to be the Russian language equivalent to the word of serfdom, just as the krepostni lindi has been translated as serfs. These translations may be correct. However, the expression of the krepostno pravo did not appear in Russian texts until the late 1830s. In other words, it's an even later concept. If we're trying to find authentic terms for this, it becomes even more difficult, but it nevertheless comes out of a Russian understanding and appreciation of their particular variation of serfdom vis-à-vis the West, and attempts to stereotype what it means to be a serf in Russia. If we consider Russian texts from the 16th to the middle of the 19th centuries, in other words, where serfdom, the second serfdom, is supposed to have existed, we find no use of the words such as the krepostno pravo, but only the krepostni lindi, which is related to the idea of a krepost, which means a deed in Russian. The limitation of peasant mobility was not a goal in itself. Such limitation did affect relationships between different groups of landowners and the state. Since the 15th century, a so-called obedience charter was granted to peasants living on state lands, which had been awarded as service landholding to members to the provincial cavalry to support them in service. Peasants were an appendage of the state, and they had to pay rents to servicemen, even though many peasants believed these lands belonged to them. This is coinciding at a time where we're seeing the consolidation of modern-day Russia as the state originating out of Moscow, the Principality of Muscovy. The so-called Sudebnik, the law reports, incorporated and widely applied the provisions that had only been intended for monastery peasants, which called for limiting the idea of peasant nobility. This around the 1450s and 60s, the beginning of Russia, the so-called gathering of lands. So in other words, you can look at the period pre-Muscovy, looking at the more sort of free-moving peasants traveling across the great rivers through all the various city-states, and saying that this concept of what would later basically become synonymous with our understanding of serfdom, but perhaps relating more closely to this idea in Russia of the krepost, actually emerges alongside of the modern Russian state, the Tsarist state. After 1565, Ivan IV, i.e. the Terrible, changed the obedience charter and added a clause stipulating that peasants were obligated to obey their landholder. Cavalrymen took this as a license to increase rent. But why were these rules adopted? An old historical view linked the encirclement of the peasantry to the evolution of economic conditions. The economic crises, famines, and population decline were also said to have led landowners to demand the state make rules tying peasants to noble estates. In this view, the rise in farm prices beginning in the 16th century and the subsequent increases in the early 17th century that occurred because of poor harvests and famines were supposed to encourage noble landowners to bind the peasantry in order to benefit from price rises. This coinciding with a great period of turmoil for Russia known as the Time of Troubles and the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. This argument is encountering increasing opposition. The relative decline in population during the middle of the 17th century has been overestimated, and furthermore, it came after nearly a century of demographic growth. In general, there is no empirical confirmation of this argument that the indebtedness of the peasantry and low population led to serfdom. In other words, this argument would lend credence to this idea that it was actually political stability and an overall instability of the status of the Russian within the time of troubles that would necessitate this idea of increasing serfdom. But again, trying to relate all of this back to, you can say, looking at political history first and social history second, it can lead you to jump the gun, so to speak, and have various suppositions about the evolutions of such institutions. Some other historians have linked these limitations to territorial expansion, the lack of manpower, as well as to tax and the military burden, which was exorbitant during this time. But in fact, most of the nobility was hostile to territorial expansion, which was viewed as a source of instability and blamed for reducing the available manpower. Indeed, measures for delimiting property were not only dictated by taxes and military requirements of the state, but they also reflected a redefinition of the relationship between social groups and the state, namely the role of land property as a social and political marker. The rules were thus appropriated by the state and broadened to include the entire peasantry in relation to Muscovite leaders in their attempt to establish a land register. Throughout the 16th and the 17th century, several rules were adopted that had the effect of limiting peasant mobility. However, these rules were actually designed to establish a cadaster to improve tax income and military conscription, while also aiming to settle disputes over estates to which there were various claimants, including the crown, the church, monasteries, and various categories of nobles. In other words, the Muscovite elite's claim and conflicts over the land were at the root of rules concerning the cadastre. Peasant mobility was only a second cause. Indeed, the peasants, as you can say, victims within the struggle of what was essentially the various estates of the realm of Muscovy, the Tsar, the nobility, the clergy, vying over influence and land and by extension manpower, but also this notion about conscription, conscripting peasants into the armies. I believe this unlocks a vital element of emancipation when we get to the proclamation in 1861. These rules meant that peasants could move from the central Black Earth lands to state or court lands if they felt so inclined. And there is no doubt that many peasants moved freely about Russia, and that the government took measures to ensure that they had the right to do so. Until the first half of the 17th century, the restriction was assumed to be temporary. By the 1630s, so this during the later reign of Tsar Michael I Romanov, landlords even came to enjoy the right to allow their peasants to move, as can be seen through many documents. Such documents were signed by landowners, for example, to let their peasants marry on another state, to move to towns, etc. In exchange for mobility, peasants had to pay fees. Upon closer examination, serfdom resembled a form of racket more than it resembled slavery. In other words, the imposition of fines and ruinous fines in some cases in order to have any form of basic right, such as moving around or marrying, rather than this notion of perpetual bondage. The process was by no means simple, as evidenced by numerous legal disputes and petitions drawn by noble families against other claimants to their properties, whether nobles, merchants, or others. The alliance between the states and the provincial and lesser nobility was supposed to offer a solution, with new rules on runaways being adopted in exchange for landowners' acceptance of this new set of rules. However, this alliance proved to be ineffective, because different state administrators were unable to cooperate in achieving a cadastre, returning runaways or punishing owners whose claims were illegitimate. To that must be added a lack of cooperation among landowners who continued to retain peasants on the move, so-called runaways. Petitions multiplied between the 1620s and 1640s, and the central state responded by lengthening the time to recover fugitives from 5 to 9 to 15 years. This was where the famous Alogeny, the intervention of 1649 during the reign of Tsar Alexis, comes in, according to many interpretations of Russian, Soviet, and even Western history. It marked the final adoption of the servile regime in Russia, and thereby the central role of the state in the process. In other words, this is a process which is defined from above. The framing is always around Tsarism. And it's a point I've made elsewhere, but the fascinating aspect of the second serfdom, as opposed to our cliche of medieval serfdom existing nearly half a millennium before this period, is that it is really through the abolition of feudalism, i.e. the abolition of this over-reliance on the nobility, which creates the conditions for serfdom. No, in Russia it seems to be the opposite. It is creating the environment for a dependent nobility, which further establishes the necessity for creating basically these rules of understanding around serfdom. It is the nobility's dependence on the Tsar which engenders the servile states, so to speak. If we read that document carefully, we find that it contains nothing concerning the organization of work on those estates. The documents mention peasants and the rural population, but not serfs. The 34 articles in the so-called Alogeny that make up this chapter define the rules governing runaways, which is to say peasants, not serfs. The term peasants refer to individuals with or without land who are members of any rural community. The runaways described in the 11th chapter of the Alogeny intervention of 1649 were said to have moved out of their own rural districts without the permission of the landowner or the local authority in order to settle in another rural district, or to place themselves under the authority of cities, monasteries, and so on. The term referred to members of the rural communities with obligations towards either private landowners or the state, or towards their rural community. The text did not refer in any way to a title of ownership of peasants, but rather to attestations of land registration of noble estates. That explains why this text included no sanction against peasants who fled, but strongly sanctioned lords who received runaways. In other words, this is in many ways about the nobles having the backing of the central government, the confirmation of the Tsar that this is my property, effectively, and we will not countenance a black market in slaves, essentially, or serfs, where they can come from one estate onto the other and thereby basically infringe upon the rights and wealth of one noble in order to enrich another. And of course, this would follow a logic. You don't want to create a system basically of private wars and vendettas between the nobility. You want to confirm them in their allegiance to the state. And so the Tsar, acting as a supreme arbiter in this situation, further solidifies this notion of dependency. Exactly as they did before the Alogeny, peasants continued to sign settlement contracts with landlords in which they define the conditions and terms of their obligations. You can actually, in some balked way, in terms of looking at this from the perception of 18th century liberalism, see this as an iteration of the social contract existing historically. But of course, it's individualized here. so much as we speak of the local rural communities. To what extent do these rules contribute to solving the long-term questions of land ownership and social status in Russia, and in particular to the unfair competition between hereditary nobles with their practice of keeping runaways, the sharp conflicts between nobles in government service and hereditary nobles, as well as the conflict between nobles and merchants? Annexation of new territories and the colonization of the Russian steppe further weakened these barely enforced rules. In 1635, a decree authorized commandants of local garrisons and southern governors to guarantee residence to fugitive peasants and not to return them to their legitimate owners. The following year, a new ordinance freed all those whose mobility had been restricted after 1613. Petition by estate owners increased so much that in 1636, the central authorities decreed the obligation to return fugitive peasants to their legitimate owners. The Illusioni, as previously referenced, sought to reinforce all of these rules. However, in the southern areas, even more than in the heartland of Russia, that being the area around the Upper Volga, the area around Moscow, because the center of power hasn't as of yet moved to St. Petersburg, these rules were barely enforced. In the eyes of some Tsarist clientele, geographical considerations overwhelmed the political and social defense of estate owners in the central areas of Russia. As a consequence, between 1678 and 1897, that being at the time of the last imperial census, peasant settlements in the central forest heartland fell from 70% to 40% of the total cultivated land, while those in the steppe areas increased from 29% to 40%. During the same period, settlements in Siberia rose from 1% to 8%. In the southern and eastern settlement areas, 1/3 of the population increase was due to natural growth and 2/3 to immigration. By the 1680s, the peasant population in the Ukrainian territories was about 500,000 people, and it doubled 40 years later by 1720. In 1678, 4 million peasants had emigrated and settled in Siberia, the northwestern areas, the Urals, the southern steppe, and the Volga. As a whole, the population in Russia had increased from 7 million in 1600 to 9 million in 1678, 14 million in 1719, 17 million in 1762, and 21 million in 1782. And if anything, to confirm how vast the Russian population growth was, the entire population of Russia in 1782 was the number of serfs that were emancipated by Tsar Alexander II only 80 years later. And indeed, all this confirms the idea that as much as we have this cliche, we have to look at this as degrees of bondage, that serfdom was much more flexible than people can imagine as this hardened system of bondage enshrined in law. There was a complicated series of negotiations between power brokers in order to enforce this. And like we see in America, expanding eastwards, expanding into Siberia, profiting from the vast fur trade, for example, throughout the 17th century, is one, and of course, by expanding and cultivating lands in the relatively wealthy areas around the Ukraine. All of this again confirms the idea that there is actually a spirit of, you can say, the American sort of internal migrant that corresponds to Russia during this period, even though we have this backdrop of, again, gradations of bondage. So, again, how do Westerners look at the system? In fact, what are the French arguments about the morality of serfdom? Voltaire completed his history of Peter the great Tsar who died in 1725. In 1763, and sent a copy to Catherine II, Catherine the Great. In this work, as in his letters, Voltaire to Catherine, Voltaire adopted a cautious attitude towards the question of Russian serfdom, indicating that it would be premature to emancipate the people without first enlightening them. For his part, Diderot, another member of the quote-unquote philosophes and encyclopedist, who was flattered by Catherine's attention, wondered, does the servitude of the peasant not influence their culture? Doesn't the lack of peasant property have a negative effect? His response was laconic. I don't know whether there is in any country a peasant that doesn't love the soil of his home more than in Russia. Our free provinces do not have much more grain than those that are not free. Diderot believed at the time in the reforming potential of Catherine the Great and the French monarchy, Based on his belief, he distinguished between nations that had already achieved their highest level of civilization and were starting to degenerate, and those that had remained closer to nature and could strive for a higher level of order and morals while avoiding the evils of civilization. He placed America and Russia among the latter, indeed cementing this notion that Russia was seen as extra-European. It was seen more alongside of the Spanish empires in the New World, and with American slavery in the 13 colonies. But there is, you could say, a remarkable whataboutism that we are not going to have this uniform idea of whether it's good to be a serf here or good to be a serf here there. Obviously, in France, which is, again, according to the philosopher, such a civilized society, we have an imperative to abolish serfdom. But in Russia, again, it seems to be a pleasant lot for the Russian serf. And you can look at this essentially and say that you can't take the words of Voltaire or Diderot or any of the philosophers who corresponded with Catherine seriously, because they were essentially trying to win her patronage, financial patronage in some cases, or just higher sort of esteem and prestige in the Russian court and the so-called Russian Enlightenment. But it's nevertheless interesting to consider that rather than looking at serfdom as this category, this standardized category that can be applied everywhere, even the European writers who were looking at Russia critically were prepared to afford Russia this exceptional status, whether the peasant was in fact more productive and happier in his state of serfdom as opposed to potentially beyond serfdom. It was not by chance that French authors often used the word serf and slave interchangeably, relating back to how they linked Russia with the Americas. The difference we recognize, that the slave can be sold without land, while the serf is attached to it, is a political and historical construct, mostly of the 19th century, and perhaps again of Marxism. In the late 18th century, philosophers and economists conflated the two phenomena, mainly to contrast them with free labour, later the free market, Adam Smith, etc. This construct also responded to a particular intellectual and political context, namely the question and status of labour in France, of course. In light of all of this, with 18th century thought ultimately quite uncertain in its view of forced labour in Russia, one can hardly say that the Russians misinterpreted these approaches and reshaped the liberalism and enlightenment of Europe into reforms that aimed to reconcile serfdom, the market, autocracy, and a nebulous reform. Indeed, the question for Russia was the same as for France. Should the legal status of the serfs be abolished entirely or modified? And furthermore, should free market economics alone determine the political and social status quo, or should it form part of a more complex political and moral order? No doubt we can also see influences from more radical revolutionary thinkers, such as one Alexander Ladyshev. Even so, it is worth noting that the most radical Russian approaches to serfdom often came from analysis of the American experience rather than the European experience, and that again will be informed by the same sense of moral fervour. However, because Catherine the Great, and hence her censors, were reticent, even hostile, and because the leanings of the Russian reformers and the Enlightenment philosophers who inspired them, this kind of radical outlook remained the minority in Russia. Catherine instead encouraged her collaborators, young economists, to familiarize themselves and disseminate the ideas of the so-called physiocrats, French variation of agricultural sort of philosophy. Mikhail Shepetov, for example, was not entirely wrong in claiming to be inspired by the French philosophers when he suggested, say, for example, keeping Peter the Great's table of ranks, which in terms of a system of ordering the civil service and nobility in the army, was perhaps one of the most radical documents of its time in the 18th century. Like Voltaire and Diderot in the same era, he emphasized that the peasants were not yet ready for freedom, and that under certain conditions or circumstances, serf labour was not necessarily less productive than free labour, because it protected the serf from economic and climate hazards. Indeed, that's a thing that always has to be considered regarding the Russian experience, its size. If you are going to wander off as a serf into Siberia, the chances are you might die. And so a lot of the framing of the argument at that time was to actually say that having a delimited zone, an area where the serf was basically under some form of protection, not only protected the serf in the sense that, again, they were part of this protection racket from the noble lord, if you're going to look at it that way, but that he was also free from the incredibly hazardous Russian climate. And there is a logic there. Even Vasily Tatishev, though distant in many ways from thinkers like Sherbatov, took up the argument dear to Enlightenment philosophy about education of the peasant, in which he concluded would eliminate the threat of revolts even while enduring a more rational organization of labor. This is just rote understanding about the Enlightenment philosophers, their belief in the equality of man, that through education, moralizing, emancipation, all men could be brought to some sort of equal condition. Some were more fervent in this hope, others were far more skeptical. But it is nevertheless an undercurrent which affects a great degree of this thinking. And you can say it universalizes the Russian peasant, but nevertheless, as we see with figures as such radical and atheistic as Diderot, they're still able to entertain this idea that perhaps, again, we shouldn't have this understanding of economics where freedom always increases the productive capabilities of the serf, and that in the Russian situation, serfdom has many advantages which, say, for example, would not exist in other situations. But there is another argument to this about defending the institution of serfdom in terms of the, again, quote unquote, primitive condition of the peasant's education, and about safety, about social cohesion, retaining this fidelity of the nobles and the illusione, the great contract, back to the Tsar. But again, whether there is something to read more into the American sort of context and the pro-slavery arguments, that they were in fact sort of relying on similar tropes about there being a fundamental differentiation and racial differentiation between peasant, serf, and the clique who now existed no longer in Moscow, the Third Rome, but now in St. Petersburg. And this is a short passage from historian Peter Kolchin. By the 18th century, Russian noblemen had come to regard themselves as inherently different from their peasants and the serfs, as inherently incapable of freedom. This sense of distinction between lord and peasant deepened over the course of the 18th century. Peter the Great contributed to it by forcing noblemen to shave their beards, and adopt Western European manners. But equally important was the natural cultural division between two very different social classes. In the 100 years before emancipation, nobleman and peasant inhabited such different worlds that the distinction between the two seemed as inherent as racial as a distinction between white and black. Again, what I find frustrating about this framing is a universalized framework where this is just a category, which can be true of many, you can say, aristocratic societies where there are gradations. In the example of Russia, we're talking about a society that had undergone a radical transformation at the beginning of the 18th century, where the capital had moved from Holy Moscow to the window on the west in St. Petersburg. It wasn't simply a matter that the nobles were changing their beards and adopting Western dress, powdered wigs, etc., but they were in many cases changing their language. There was the proliferation of French as the court language within Russia. There was also this notion that Germans were everywhere. In fact, during the 1730s, Germans, in particular Baltic Germans, were in such a period of ascendancy that it's called the Belonovchina, which is in reference to the Duke of Courland, who was the, if I remember correctly, the lover of Tsarina Anna during this period. So Germans were perceived to be in an ascendancy, and of course, living in a capital so remote, especially from heartland Russia and rural Russia, as St. Petersburg was on the Baltic Sea, with its Italian architecture and its sort of Venetian / sort of Stockholmian feel to it. Of course, this would confirm this notion of a separation, and this could be as much as a consequence of moving from Moscow to St. Petersburg as to the whole institution of serfdom in and of itself. I think it's important to draw that distinction. It is noteworthy then, but perhaps not entirely surprising, that Russian noblemen invented many of the same racial arguments to defend serfdom that American slave owners used to justify their institution. And when we're talking about racial arguments, we should understand that race as a category is evolving in terms of popular imagination and conception at this time. race in the 18th century has a very different currency to race as it will be understood in the latter half of the 19th century, for example. The arguments were not elaborately worked out. One does not find tomes exploring the physiological differences between peasant and nobleman. I would actually argue that in many cases they did exist, especially about looking at the slightly later on in the 19th century and looking at the racial origins of certain groups of Russia, whether we're talking about steppe influences, um, even sort of Scythian, Amazonian influences, Sarmatian influences, Nordic influences, looking at this idea of a Norman yoke. There are many different arguments you can bear, and these definitely did exist. The basic assumptions, however, were similar. They were racial, in that they were predicated on the belief in inherent and immutable differences rather than distinctions based on particular social and environmental conditions. And of course, in terms of that distinction existing, it helps that there is so much of a physical and cultural separation that didn't really exist until the 1720s, the 1730s. Peasants were just as intrinsically lazy, childlike, and requiring of direction as were American blacks. Thus, when Prince Sherbatov, who has been mentioned, the most persistent exponent of the nobility's interest in the late 18th century, asserted that without strict supervision, peasants would not perform agricultural labour because of their voluptuousness, i.e., their vice and their sexual proclivities and their laziness. In 1802, Nicholas Karamazin, a great Russian historian, rebuted the environmentalist argument, sometimes advanced by foreigners, that Russian peasants were lazy because of serfdom. On the contrary, he insisted they are lazy from nature, from habit, from ignorance of the advantages of diligence. So the advocates of Russian serfdom pointed to free or state peasants and maintained that they would have been happier as serfs under the protection of noble landowners. During his short reign, Emperor Paul was able to act on his belief in the desirability of distributing all state peasants to so-called plomoshyki, noble landowners, by awarding generous grants of state lands and peasants to deserving noblemen, and he rejoiced in placing peasants under the supervision of police masters who would both care for them and guard the peace and security of the state. This can be seen as an intensification of the policies of Peter and Catherine. Indeed, there are arguments advanced by another historian who I'm interested in have read, which is Alexander Erkind, who takes this argument and actually applies so-called post-colonial aspects to it as well. You have to undergird this with a very flexible attitude on what race means, and my emphasis is that this is all pertaining to a cultural alienation of St. Petersburg from the so-called real Russia. Indeed, if you look at the reigns of Alexander III, Tsar Nicholas II, the penultimate and the last Tsar, so much of their reforms, their re-identification with the peasantry seems to be about overcoming this westernization of the Russian aristocracy, of the Russian court, and wanting to reaffirm their identity before the Russian peasant who represents the true Russia. In terms of serfdom and its advantage over wage labour, morally speaking, I want to return to Stasiani. Though paradoxical at first glance, we find criticism of wage labour and hence a certain rehabilitation of serfdom or slavery in authors who, unlike Marx or Ricardo, another free economist, put ethical considerations first. Thus, in one of the letters, say for example, of Friedrich Le Play, he wrote to his sister in 1844 from Nizhnaya Zalda, he marvelled at the beauty of nature and the condition of the serfs. The peasant serf in this part of Russia, and particularly on this estate, enjoy a well-being of which the French peasant and workers have no idea. Every family possesses for its property a house and a garden as large as the family could desire. In the same enclosure there is, apart from the house and garden, a courtyard and a building for the animals and provisions. The Russian case is precisely what strengthened Le Play's convictions about the industrialization in France and the West. Individualism and the accumulation of wealth degraded men, negating their humanity, and formal freedoms did not prevent material servitude. This would be, you can say, the spirit of the law and constitutions versus conditions as they naturally exist. This point is crucial for all utopian socialists and Christian socialist literature of the first half of the 19th century, which argued that formal liberty counts for little if industrialization creates a material subjugation. At a certain point, economic laws become more powerful than juridical laws, and so the only possible solution is to moralize the economy. Indeed, if you're looking at Stalin's arguments later and collectivization, this has to be understood that forcing, and later even Maoism, that forcing the peasantry into industrialized labor, in other words, speed running capitalism in order to arrive at your communist utopia, is in fact actually intensifying what these early utopian socialist writers were warning about earlier, which is that serfdom and the condition of the rural community is enviable, and we have lost something as a result of industrialization. It has been lost in the West. Let us not arrive at that situation within Russia, but nevertheless, that is the paradox that we see. These various observations can also be found among French travellers of this time, the early 19th century. From 1819 and 1824, for example, Émile Dupré de Saint-Maury discussed serfdom in Russia while he was really thinking about Napoleon and the French Revolution. He emphasized that the thought that there are still in Europe Christians who are tied to the land is as burdensome to the imagination as it is to the heart. Yet he added that freedom should not be granted too abruptly, or there will be more opposition from the peasants than from among the nobility. He cited the liberation brought by Napoleon and how the peasants themselves had asked to return to their previous condition once the French army had left. You could say this was a fact sort of represented in Tolstoy and War and Peace, which is actually a point I'm going to come back to later. In his eyes, these reactions were explained by the advantages of serfdom. The Russian peasant is less subject to anxieties and fear of impoverishment than those of other countries. The landowner is completely responsible for the existence of those who cultivate the fields. Accidents, drought, or the winter do not bother the peasant because the master will take care of these problems. It's obviously a form of dependency, but from the point of view of the defenders of serfdom, even those who are critical of it in the abstract, like the French visitors, will see it perhaps again as a somewhat functioning system of noblesse oblige. Likewise, he claimed that in industry, where the number of arms often exceed the need for them, the worker is never plagued with fatigue. He does his job peacefully, like our day labourers in France, who do things at their own relaxed pace. One never sees, as with us, women working laboriously in the vineyards, or handling a spade, or children degrading their nascent strength through premature toil. Finally, he thought one should not believe that French farms that relied on wage labour were more profitable than Russian estates, as supervisors could not really keep watch over their workers, and once their eyes were turned, the workers would stop working. It was therefore in Russia that during the first half of the 19th century, especially during the reign of Nicholas I, this is after Napoleon and his invasion, Russian reformers and intellectuals often shared the tendency of some Western economists to relativize the opposition between free and forced labor. Proletarians became slaves, serfs enjoyed quite reasonable living and working conditions. From there, it was but a step to not seeing any opposition between churches from changes from below and reforms imposed from above by force. Both methods could ostensibly coexist perfectly, just as incentives and constraints could both serve to regulate labor. This is also why there was no pro-serf movement in Russia at the same magnitude, say for example, as those defending slavery in the United States. Kolchin explains these different attitudes by the fact that in the United States the opposition between master and slave was rooted more firmly in race, whereas in Russia it existed more in legal status. The American slave owners lived on their estates, whereas the Russian nobles were absentees, a fact that Alexander II would exploit quite ruthlessly. But that is only part of the argument. In Russia, the debate on serfdom was but one of many changes to take place during the country during the period of dramatic social and political upheaval. Like Russia's political and intellectual elites, its nobility were ultimately less afraid of the peasants' emancipation than of their proletarianization, and as the latter issue became the focus of the discussion, nobles gradually began to accept the abolition of serfdom. At some point, the idea that wage labour was the first worst form of slavery was accepted by much of the Russian elite. That is why in the 20 years preceding emancipation, the debate on serfdom intersected with that about the commune, and then about Russia's uniqueness. It was not so much the abolition of serfdom that was discussed, but when and how, and consequently the status of the commune and of property. The emphasis on the commune or private property made it possible to relegate to the background the details of what emancipation was supposed to mean, and just what kind of labour contract and labour relations would be in place after the emancipation. In other words, in terms of looking at the moral impetus behind emancipation, it really was secondary. Russian onlookers and the commentariat were looking at Europe. They were looking at the conditions of the industrial condition. They were perhaps again imbibing early Marxist arguments, such as Engels writing about the condition of the English working classes and saying that serfdom is preferable if we are again going to relinquish this status, if we're going to abolish serfdom again. It's more about this constant argument about negotiation, reconfiguring the relationship between the noble, the peasant, and the Tsar, as we'll later see. It's not simply a case that this, again, even from the point of view of the Russians, this institution is so vile, so horrible, that we are obliged, not just for moral reasons, but also for economic reasons, to abolish it. Rather, there is the fear of proletarianism. And again, the added irony to all of this, which is that as much as there may have been a fear, a denigration, even you can say the elevation of serfdom vis-a-vis industrial wage labour, and seeing that as a form of slavery, that it would ultimately be Marxism, Leninism that subordinates and reforms and revolutionizes the notion of agriculture to subordinate it to essentially a form of industrial servitude. Now, this is where I want to come briefly to Leo Tolstoy. I've already alluded to him with Napoleon and War and Peace, but nevertheless, he discusses this notion of, you could say, the moral arguments and the condition of emancipation in Russia, post-emancipation, the status of the peasant, and covers it also extensively in Anna Karenina, and I want to cite it. Before I get to Anna Karenina, this is a short segment from Anne Hruska in Love and Slavery, Serfdom and Emancipation in Tolstoy's fiction. Despotism always brings about the despotism of slavery. Despotisms of the landowners have already created the despotism of the peasants. When the peasants had gathered together and told me to give them all their land, and I said to them that I'd be left without it, with a shirt on my back, they laughed. And they can't be blamed for that. That's the way it had to be. Now is not the time to think about historical fairness and the advantages of one social class. We need to save the whole building from the fire that is about to engulf it in any minute. To me, it's clear that the landowners are now facing the following question: your land or your life? If you read that again, it would actually contrast with a lot of the arguments that are brought up with Russia having, you can say, a lack of a strong pro-serfdom movement among the aristocracy. And they would look to Alexander II as this midway. We need to have reform under our control. We need to guide and lead the process of reform. We need to manage the social conditions in Russia. Hence why a proclamation from the Tsar, even though again apparently it's the Tsar's, the despotism that's brought around this quote-unquote slavery, emphasis on that word and it becoming synonymous with serfdom, that in itself will be reformed and a new relationship between the autocrat and the serf will be established here. If we were to fail in that relationship, in that reform, then essentially it would result in the overthrow of the state. The prospect of an imminent end to serfdom met with a wide range of reactions from the gentry, the nobility. The overwhelming reaction on the part of literary intellectuals, though, was one of joy. However, Tolstoy's reaction to the prospect of an end to serfdom was considerably more ambivalent. A few years later, in 1854, Tolstoy had written in his diary, "It's true that slavery is an evil, but it's an extremely lovable evil." In other words, that sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? A lovable evil, but lovable in the sense, again, that it would seem to transcend liberal conceptions, Enlightenment conceptions about the status of man, and the actual condition of the serf is far more favourable to conditions of, again, quote-unquote freedom that we see, such as industrial labour. And I'll explore it more by looking at Anna Karenina. One of the characters, say for example, in Anna Karenina, is a marshal, a district marshal, who is a friend to the co-protagonist, Konstantin Levin, who is actually a Tolstoy self-insert in many ways. The character is called Sviazhsky. He was one of those people, invariably amazed Levin, whose judgment was very logical, though never original, and was kept apart from their conduct, while their manner of life was very definite and stable, its tendency being quite independent of their judgment, he even clashing with it. Sviazhsky was an extreme liberal. He despised the gentry and considered the majority of noblemen to be secretly in favour of serfdom, and only prevented by cowardice from expressing their views, in other words, cowardice of the reforming direction of the Tsar himself. He considered Russia to be doomed, a country like Turkey, and the Russian government so bad that he did not think it worthwhile seriously to criticize its actions. Yet he had an official position, a model marshal of the nobility, and when he travelled always he wore a cockade and a red band to his cap. In other words, you can say the quintessential quote-unquote westernizer existing within Russia. He imagined that to live as a human being was possible only in a foreign country, where he went to stay at every opportunity. Yet he carried on very complicated and perfect agricultural pursuits in Russia, and carefully followed and knew what was being done there. He considered the Russian peasant to be 1 degree higher than an ape in development, yet at distinct elections no one shook hands with the peasants and listened to their opinions more willingly than he. He believed in neither God nor devil, yet he was much concerned by the question of improving the condition of the clergy and limiting parishes, as was at the same time particularly active in seeing that the church should be retained in his village. In other words, as much as he may deplore the state, he may again use these racialist arguments about the deplorable condition of the peasant, and he may say that Russia is a moribund society. Russia is not European. Russia is something beyond. Russia is something like the Ottomans, who are collapsing throughout the 19th century. And yet again, there is this confused relationship that when face to face with the Russian example, he cannot again feel the desire to intermingle and feel a conception of, again, fidelity to the parochial, to the village, to the mir. In contrast to him, there is, Tolstoy presents, the landowner with the quote-unquote grey moustache in conversation with Levin, and another figure called Mikhail Petrovich, this on the idea of the condition of the peasant post-serfdom. The wealth of the community as a whole is ruined by these new methods, where my land, this being the land of the landowner, used to yield ninefold under serfdom with good management, and now yields threefold when the labourers are paid in kind. Russia has been ruined by the emancipation of the peasants. Sviazhsky looked at Levin with smiling eyes, even made a just and perceptible sarcastic sign to him, ridiculing the old man. But Levin did not consider the landowner's words ridiculous. He understood him better than he did understand Sviazhsky. Much of what the landowner said subsequently, to prove that Russia was ruined by the emancipation, even appeared to Levin to be true and undeniable. The landowner was evidently expressing his own thoughts, which people rarely do, thoughts to which he had been led not by a desire to find some occupation for an idle mind, in other words, like a westernizer or a philosopher, but by the conditions of his life, thoughts with which he had hatched in his rural solitude and considered from every side, in other words, practical experience. The fact of the matter is, you see, that progress can only be achieved by authority, he said, evidently wishing to show that education was not foreign to him. Take, for instance, the reforms of Peter the Great, of Catherine the Great, of Tsar Alexander I. Take European history. In the realm of agriculture, it is still more so. To name only potatoes, they even had to be introduced by force into this country. Our primitive ploughs, you know, have not always been used. They must have been introduced during the time of the Rurik princes, and doubtless by force. So this would have been perhaps again during the time of the Kievan Rus, or perhaps even before the Mongol invasions. Now, in our case, we landlords under serfdom applied improving methods of agriculture. We introduced the winnowing machines and all sorts of tools, organized the carting of manure, all by our authority, and the peasants at first resisted and afterwards copied us. Now that serfdom has been abolished and the power taken out of our hands, our agriculture, where it has been brought to a high level, must descend to a savage and primitive condition. Now, this is interesting because it confirms the opinion of Tsar Paul in his attitude of, you can say, confirming this sense of perceived noblesse oblige, reattaching the serf in his obligation to his local lord, in this case gentry and landowners more generally. But notice the argument that it is state-directed authority. Only through authority can progress be achieved. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. This isn't an accident, and I don't think we should look it over, because even though Tolstoy was writing in the 1870s and the 1880s, these the arguments with which Stalin, in particular, would understand that one needs a revolution from above, one needs to have someone at the helm driving these events in order to achieve a demonstrable improvement within the condition of the agricultural labourer. It is not simply a case that we can sit back and allow for quote unquote market forces to achieve everything we want to achieve. No, the arguments about the defence of serfdom also rest on this notion of fidelity to authority, and post-emancipation, the desire from a certain sect of, again, more Slavophile opinion to resurrect and reconfigure something that was perceived to be lost. With the Emancipation Proclamation, so for example, one of its chief conservative so-called architects, one Yuri Samarin, had stressed that emancipation must preserve the communal life of the peasant, the mir, though, as with Tolstoy's Levin, there exists a real-world parallel in the landowner reformer in Alexander Koshelev, straddling the lines between so-called liberalism and conservatism through his particular expression of Slavophilia. Slavophilia, to be a Slavophile, is a rather nebulous category within Russia. People associate it with conservatism of all stripes, whatever that means. Conservatism in what sense? Slavophilia would mean fidelity to the people, which conception of people, what idea of Russia. It tends to be, again, this idea of a Russian people or folk who have a strong affinity to the church and to their leader, the Tsar, through which, again, society is indivisible in terms of him consecrating it. And this is an article from Mark Rayev going over the views of Koshelev, again, one of the architects of the Emancipation Proclamation. In Hegelian tradition, but deviating from the more usual Slavophile conservative patterns, Koshelev's political and economic thinking was based on his views of the state. But in good Slavophile tradition, for him too, the starting point was an organic and indissoluble union of Tsar and people. Indeed, this idea of organic conceptions of historical units, this is going, I would say, actually a lot of German thinkers, less than Russian thinkers. Schlegel, Herder, who then import their arguments through one of the great Tsarist ideologues who spoke and wrote in French, who was none other than Sergei Uvarov. As in most romantic conceptions of this kind, this union was nothing more than a concrete spiritual bond, similar to that of a father's relationship to members of his family, hence the Tsar and his identity as the little father. He believed, however, Koshelov, in the St. Petersburg bureaucracy, and that it was a Germanic importation, had erected a wall between the Tsar and the people, so that the government, i.e. the Tsar, had no true idea of the people's wants and needs, and that, contrary to an erroneous and frequently held opinion, the nobility was not responsible for this wall. It was essential to eradicate this bureaucracy, for it corrupted every act of the state, however well-intentioned. Speaking as an opponent of the editorial commission, Koshelev declared, "We saw in your complicated, petty, and strictly finite proposal of an exaltation of bureaucracy, which would kill the life of the people and the local significance of the landowners, and by replacing these with regulations, the universally hated bureaucracy will only be strengthened." It's not, again, just the fact that it's a admonition against the bureaucratization of life, the devolution of this relationship to that of managerial relations between the centre and the periphery. It's more than that. Identifying the bureaucracy as German is going back to the period in the 18th century where Germans were in ascendancy in the Russian court, and basically saying that this is kind of like a version of Prussianism, enlightened despotism, fidelity to the Tsar, but ultimately fidelity to the manager, to the bureaucrat. This is something foreign. This is not something which accords with our understanding of the world, in other words, the Slavophile's interpretation of the world. No, the Slavophile is to at once profess his loyalty towards the Tsar, yet dispossess the Tsar of any, you can say, delusions or desire to obfuscate his role from that of Russia, from the people, to a more Europeanized conception of power, and even getting rid of the nobility in order to create, you can say, the system of managers. Again, it's this, only in Russia you can say that these unique conditions can exist, and all of this pertains around rallying the peasant, rallying the new communes, the mere post-emancipation of the serf to the Russian Tsar. Whereas before, during serfdom, you can say the relationship was quite clear. The noble lord, the gentry, is loyal to the Tsar and is there to protect and keep the serf. So what essentially is the new condition for the serf? Yes, on the one hand, it allows for a degree of economic mobility. It allows for more, you can say, manpower to enter into Russian cities and create the conditions for Russian industrialization as it was lagging behind the West. And these arguments were all taking place during the Crimean War. Yet at the same time, we don't want to deal with the house being destroyed or set alight. We want these social conditions to be properly managed by the Tsar at the top, a reform, a revolution being directed from above. In Koshelev's opinion, the only way of solving the great problems confronting Russia was to convoke a Zemskaya Duma in Moscow, the heart of Russia, far from its existing bureaucratic center. A Zemsky Sobor or other such institution, for example, had elected Michael, the first Romanov Tsar. Again, a fact that was actually quite inconvenient to them, the fact that the first Romanov Tsar had been elected, and that Russia owes a tradition which is perhaps more in keeping with other European, Eastern European countries, where the nobility had, and the church especially, had more influence over the Tsar. But by the time we come to Peter the Great, that really is the inception of this bureaucratic cliche, you can say, within Russian thinking. The table of ranks was referenced earlier. There is no perhaps greater expression of bureaucratization of the army and of the nobility than something like the table of ranks, where everything and civil service roles are measured and everyone is placed in terms of this identity figured around service to the state and by extension service to the Tsar. If this is a revolt against Peter the Great, against St. Petersburg, naturally this would involve moving the capital back to Russia to ensure that the communal relationship between the center and the peasant and the Tsar is reformed properly. By eliminating this wall between people and Tsar, this Duma would become the spokesperson of the land before the throne. It would provide exhaustive information on the state of the nation and transmit to the throne the wishes of the people. The irony of this, before I get into Koshelev's argument, is that a similar organization was convoked by Catherine the Great, and it quickly devolved into arguments around merchants and non-nobles having the right to hold on to serfs. So the first time this organization, or something equivalent, a facsimile of this organization, was produced for over 100 years, it was rather a desire to expand the use and the holdings of serfs rather than eliminate it. So this is an interesting inversion of that. But going back to Koshelev, if the government really wants to know the present opinion of the country and elicit useful advice, the only possible way is to let those people whose opinion one wishes to know elect representatives for this specific purpose. And why does the government fear these elections? Only these bureaucrats who want to continue to fish in troubled waters have to fear the election of a new capable and independent people, so simultaneously conservative, yet within the context of Russia you can say rather radical. Before 1861, before the proclamation, naturally, there had been no desire to share governmental and administrative powers, but the emancipation had produced different conditions. As long as millions of people were merely things which could be sold and bought and thousands were their masters, there could be no question of local self-government, where there or judicial reform based on any kind of justice. Even less could be a question of a participation of the nation in the lawmaking and higher administrative work of the state. Now that the possibility for these changes has been given, their necessity becomes apparent, and you could argue again from the point of view of the conservative, the slippery slope, that the anticipation of these reforms inevitably lead to a wholesale restructuring of the state. Koshelov is arguing this from a conservative point of view ostensibly, and yet one can read this as a radical sort of herald of what would happen in the 1905 Russian Revolution, where a Duma was in fact created. As an institution, the concept of a Duma rested on old historical tradition, whose elective principle is older than Russia itself. By Russia, they're referring to Muscovy. For only the establishment of a bureaucracy sounded the death knell of these consultative Dumas, in other words, Peter the Great's reform. Yet the Tsar's absolutism would not disappear even with the Duma. As Russia became an independent country and extended her borders and the power of the Tsar grew stronger and even more absolute, consultative assemblies were called from time to time. In these, representatives of the nation gave their opinion on matters submitted for the consideration by the government and informed the latter of the needs of the people, but the Tsars made their decisions according to their will. Hence, a definite split between Russia and how it identifies these assemblies. These are not assemblies from which basically the Tsar will defer and he will effectively allow for power to change hands from his own appointed ministers to elected parliamentarians effectively. No, this is a consultative assembly only. It is not representative of some sort of national will or democratic impetus. And this is important because if you conflate these ideas and believe that these Dumas actually do represent the people, the Narod, and this combines with a lot of liberal and pan-Slavic arguments as well, that the Narod is supreme over the Tsar, then this has revolutionary implications as well. So the conservative cope, in this case, of figures like Koshelov, is to reaffirm that no, this is to break down the wall which inhibits the peasant from being able to voice his opinion to the Tsar. In other words, you can say this is the emphasis of creating a network of petitions rather than usurping power from the autocracy. Koshelov had to keep autocracy as the basis of Russian political life, for only it could bring about the change without provoking anarchy. For us, at present, autocracy is essential. It alone could, in time, peacefully destroy serfdom and make a land allotment to the peasants. It alone could solve the many problems vital to Russia from above, without disruption. Koshelov shared the general Slavophile belief in the dignity of the individual. The state and its agents would have to cease to treat the people like chattels. The principal cause of these pitiful conditions of the country resides in the fact that the government of Russia lives in isolation, i.e. in St. Petersburg. We are something alien to it, and in turn do not consider it part of ourselves. For the government consists of people who have been in service too long, and who regard private persons like a herd of sheep or cows which can be shorn or milked, but whose opinion is a matter of indifference. This would also apply to absentee nobles in St. Petersburg, especially the more dissolute ones, from which emancipation was basically an opportunity for them to pay off their debts. A degraded people made for bad subjects, and this in turn for a very poor country indeed. Such a treatment of people was demoralizing, both to rulers and the ruled, just as previously serfdom had degraded serfs and owners alike. The peasants, though numerous and strong, will never be on the level of first-class citizens of the state. Their relationship to the government must always remain indirect. For this reason, they needed intermediaries. If the people has needed us, an enlightened nobility, it, more than we, is afraid of the bureaucrats. Now we can become its guide. Their peasants, most natural and most convenient and most friendly intermediaries, can be the best men among those who living on the land, i.e. the landowners. These will not only be noblemen, i.e. class completely alienated from the peasants' way of life, but people living in close relationship to them, and maybe only yesterday's fellow members in the mere. The remainder of the village's population will be inimical but favourable to us, for among us there will be their kin, in whom they have the confidence and whom they respect. Again, in terms of actually looking at Levin, Constantine, in Anna Karenina, this is actually Koshelov interpreting that as again, a potential solution to this of the Mir, as opposed to, again, existing within this alienated society in St. Petersburg. Moreover, each inhabitant, upon fulfillment of certain conditions, can take a seat among us. Even the largest contingent will be made up of peasants, closely identified with the people's spiritual and cultural needs, and admitting them into our ranks, we, the nobility, shall receive new and healthy forces among the masses of the rural population, and through them we shall unite with the people. We shall establish, maintain, and increase our ties with the strongest and least spoiled part of the nation. That is the theory. That was the hope. You can say that was the aspiration for the last half a century of Tsarism. Of course, it should be mentioned that as so much of serfdom was prefigured around these ideas of contracts, racketeering, you could argue, paying nobles for the right to do something, there were vast indemnity payments which the peasant effectively had to pay back to the lord in order to earn their freedom. In other words, you can actually look at emancipation not so much as dramatic as all that, but rather returning to a condition that we saw before 1649, where it was essentially a matter of paying certain dues, paying certain rents to the lord in order to ensure and acquire certain rights, to sign certain contracts. Rather, emancipation seems to follow along these lines. It was done in a very conservative tenor, which you can say from one point of view primarily benefited the nobility financially in the short term. Therefore, there is a cynical reading from this, from Alexander II's point of view, that to bring the nobility on side, this was essentially a way of bypassing them to ensure that the nobility were no longer responsible for the peasant, and yet also, again, creating a system of dependency of the nobility on the Tsar by, again, the fact that this system of remittances, these payments, are ensured by the proclamation. The Tsar is also leading the reforms, so any noble who stands outside of the system is, by extension, outside of the autocracy. That, again, is a remarkable thing about Russian Tsarism. The Tsar is the spiritual leader of Russia, the Tsar is the temporal leader of Russia, and so to stand against the Tsar's reform, the Tsar himself declaring the emancipation, effectively makes it a holy edict, the ukaz. It's also, from the point of view of Alexander II, I believe, a concession to Russian nationalism. The idea that we are going to make provinces of the empire, such as the Ukraine and the Baltic states, more Russian. What better way, again, to afford the 20 million or so serfs living within Russia a greater conception of their rights and indeed their belonging to a national whole, a Nolodnya. And this would allow for easier conscription, which again was effectively the result in the 1870s. We see conscription, and a few years later we see the Russo-Turkish War, which you can say again as this attempt to resolve the crisis which was left by the Crimean War. Alexander II's reign is that of a great system of reform between the Crimean War and the Russo-Turkish War. What, however, is quite, you can say, frustrating for the Russian elites is that when they get to the Russo-Turkish War, Russia does not perform perhaps as well as it ought to have in that situation and is humiliated on the world stage. But nevertheless, you can say all of these reforms, emancipation, is primarily, again, to place Russia once more on a post-Crimean war footing, not just a war footing against the Ottomans, but on a war footing with the West and indeed with Germany. But Alexander II is murdered in 1881 and he's replaced by his quote-unquote conservative son, Alexander III, who affirms a document called the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy. We have the playing around of various ideas relating to these consultative assemblies or Dumas. Even on the day he was assassinated, it should be mentioned, but these notions, under the influence primarily of Pobedonostsev, the grey eminence, you can say, of the last couple of decades of the 20th century, these plans are shelved, and there is instead, as you can see, Alexander III and his people in this image, a reaffirmation of this relationship between the Tsar having no higher authority or having essentially being accountable to nothing. He represents the people. It's simply a matter of rekindling, rebolstering that relationship. And these are some arguments taken from Thomas Pearson's on the land captains, a segment, you can say, of reforming the communal relations between the centre and agriculture. Few problems preoccupied Tsarist officials in the post-reform period more than finding suitable officials to supervise peasant self-government. In other words, these people who would, as Koshelev would argue, be closer to the mirs, to be of the mirs basically, but nevertheless guiding them. The Emancipation edicts and subsequent reforms of the 1860s established peasant self-government as an integral part of the state administration, and in abolishing the landlord's authority over his serfs, assigned to the village collective responsibility for the payment of various taxes, the preservation of rural order, and, beginning in 1864, the enforcement of Zemstvo decisions to ensure, and these were basically local sort of government charters and organizations to ensure the newly elected peasant officials acted legally and efficiently. Alexander II introduced peace arbiters when he emancipated the serfs in 1861. Selected by the Senate, these local landlords were to mediate land disputes between the peasants and their former landlords, to guide the activities of the village and the volost, peasant officials, until the peasant population was sufficiently educated and experienced to participate with non-peasants in a system of self-government in the village. By all accounts, in the peace arbitrations of the early 1860s, there were remarkable successes in performing the duties. They worked so efficiently at their primary task, resolving land-related grievances, that by the end of the 1860s, Zemstvo officials who subsidized both the local justices of the peace and the peace arbitrators petitioned en masse for relief from the latter obligation. The statute of June 27, 1874, which replaced the arbitrators in most provinces in European Russia, with roughly half as many local district bureaus and their permanent members, elected and paid by local institutions, ostensibly fulfilled this purpose. Yet certain provisions of this legislation revealed that the government's main concern was a more effective system of supervising these officials. The corruption and arbitrariness of these officials in dispensing public grain reserves and village justice had come under government investigation in the years 1871 to 2, and in the 1874 statute granting the district bureaus jurisdiction over entire districts as opposed to several volosti, in other words, peasant organizations or charters, officialdoms, in the case of the arbitrators, and explicitly enjoined them to concentrate on supervising peasant administration by overseeing the the collection of taxes by the district police chief and the village and volost officials, by conducting regular and thorough inspections of the volost administration, and by investigating peasant complaints against peasant officials and court decisions. Any illusions that Tsarist officials had about effectiveness of this new legislation were soon dispelled, however. Beginning in 1875, Zemstvo petitions, gubernatorial reports, memorandums from the district bureaus themselves complained about the latter's inefficiency in supervising peasant officials, especially in connection with the massive build-up of tax arrears in the late 1870s. Perhaps the most convincing proof of the government's concern over rising arrears and the government's growing conviction that unsupervised peasant officials were at the heart of the problem was a spate of stopgap legislation during 1878 designed to increase the supervisory authority of bureaus. To underscore the government's commitment to rural control and proper tax collection, the Committee of Ministers passed a law on June 14, 1878, that required permanent members to conduct thorough investigations of villages and volosti at regular intervals and gave them disciplinary powers over peasant officials. Although it ignored the obvious shortage of district bureau personnel, still the legislation signified the state's genuine concern about peasant administration amidst the Russo-Turkish War and the government's campaign against revolutionary terrorists. Ultimately, the shortcomings of this law convinced the government to overhaul peasant self-government entirely. When Alexander II was murdered, Alexander III, as I mentioned, comes in. We see the creations of these ideas of land captains. Land captains amid the friction between local government, the peasant elders, the representative committees, the Zemstvo, and this looming question, which is so feared by the Slavophiles, of bureaucratization. Much of this new peasant policy was the work of Alexander's interior minister, Dmitry Tolstoy, I understand this might be confusing given I've spoken a lot about Leo Tolstoy, but you'll just have to bear with me. Dmitri Tolstoy, see, even I've done it, in his Land Captains Project of 1887. The losses of public funds, the excesses of apathy of the authorities, the obvious coercion, arbitrariness, flaunting of the law, bribery, and other crimes and violations have become a common occurrence with the Volost and village elders and other peasant administrative officials in the past decade. In other words, you have abolished the noble landowners, the gentry, their possession of serfs, and you replaced it with these experiments in peasant self-government, the mirs, connecting them to a lot of French-inspired judicial and local government authorities, and it's created, in the end, towards the end of the reign of Tsar Alexander II, a bit of a debacle, a mess, which, from the point of view of the Russian government's bottom line, is not only perhaps again impeding that relationship between the center and the periphery in a spiritual sense, but more practically in terms of building up a huge amount of tax arrears and lax administration. So, how are we to find this elusive quality which bypasses formal bureaucratization, allows for these communities to exist? Well, from the point of view of the interior minister, it is the idea of a land captain. A few lines after Tolstoy stressed that under such conditions the peasants had lost respect for all authority, and that adverse consequences of anarchy for the village community that everyone recognizes indicate the urgent need for establishing administrative supervision over the village population in general, and especially over the administration of the peasants. Aside from restoring order, Tolstoy insisted on establishing land captains as a means of protecting the poorer peasants from exploitation by the melodi, in other words, the mere gentry or the mere elders or officials, which again, Koshilev, as alluded to earlier, believed was going to be the solution to this issue. No, from a certain point of view, these officials have become the sources of their own peasant exploitation, thus strengthening peasant political support for autocracy by allowing for an intercessor in the situation. Indeed, there is much about Tolstoy's plan to cultivate peasant loyalty to the throne that anticipated Stolypin, the later Russian prime minister's wager on the strong 2 decades later. With peasant complaints of recent years in mind, Tolstoy emphasized to his land captains a proposal that the dark people have no concept of the separation of powers. They merely are seeking an authority to protect them, or at least to tell them what to do. By the dark people, these are actually references to another sort of identity for the peasant, which was the Black Hundreds. It would also confirm again the racial stereotypes that are supposed to exist between St. Petersburg society and the peasantry at the same time, that these are different peoples. They need to be treated in a certain way. They don't have the same conception, a Europeanized conception of, I mean, in terms of the separation of powers, again, this is going back to the advent of the word serfdom. This is Montesquieu. This is the spirit of the laws. All these arguments being used over and over again with Diderot, that the Russian peasant, again, from the point of view of even the more sympathetic Slavophile supporters of the Russian autocracy, are using similar arguments. You cannot treat the serf from their perspective as you would, say, for example, a person in quote unquote enlightened St. Petersburg society. The land captains in the countryside would not only curb the problems in local government inherent in the reforms of the 1860s, emancipation, but benefit the autocracy, the peasantry, the landed gentry, whose welfare depended on a sound peasant economy, but would provide the government with a vehicle to direct the nature and tempo of rural modernization, while cultivating peasant political support in the process. Again, modernization, linking back to my argument about Alexander II, that so much of the impetus for reforms was, again, less enlightened opinion, but more so, again, as we see, the arguments around morality with the emancipation are not that simple. They're very complicated. It comes back to this idea of putting Russia on a war footing and therefore improving the status and effectiveness and the methods involved in agriculture. It goes back again to Leo Tolstoy's grey moustached landowner, that through proper management, direction, getting rid of these deracinated wage labourers, the peasant community can be led to modernization by the autocracy, by authority, And as the engines of modernization, they can export more wheat, Russia can be more prosperous, they can support a larger pool of manpower, larger armies, Russia is stronger. Yet Dmitry Tolstoy's plans had pitfalls, not the least of which were his assertions that 34 governors could rigorously patrol 2,000 or so land captains, and his blind faith that peasants were more willing to obey the state than the public gentry officials. Such claims place the prestige of the autocracy, and not the gentry, on line. Perhaps the greatest shortcomings in his proposals was that it was too expedient a solution for the multifaceted administrative and economic problems in the village. As such as it distracted the government from an imaginative economic solution to alleviate peasant hardships in the 1880s, steps which the government took only after the famines of 1890. The chances that Tolstoy's gamble on state control would pay off were likewise diminished in the years after 1889, as rival ministers and opponents cut away at a monolithic control that the interior minister had sought to establish over the provinces from top to bottom. This is something also that Stolypin would attempt to establish, a centralized ministry, and this is also the case with the agricultural portfolios and later Russian cabinets, whereas the Tsars would pit these officials against each other, not wanting one position to become so irresistible and paramount whereby they could actually threaten the position of the Tsar itself. In other words, it was a prerogative of Alexander III and his son Nicholas II to ensure that neither a democratic situation or a parliamentary situation would ever threaten the authority of the Tsar, but there wouldn't be a Bismarck situation where you have a domineering, all-powerful civilian leader who is nevertheless accountable to the ruler, like you have with the chancellorship in Germany. And again, all of these measures post-emancipation, first of all, we have the mir, the village communities, the zemstvo, the governorships, now the land captains. All of this has seemed to massively, massively complicate what had been a relatively simple relationship, which was the landed gentry fidelity to the Tsar, they protect the peasant, and they basically, again, ensure a degree of productivity. So, from the point of view of Tsar Alexander II, a common criticism during his reign was that under Tsar Peter the Great, the reins of state, the impetus for reform, were racing ahead inexorably, almost uncontrollably, but Tsar Peter was so strong that he was able to hold the reins and keep the carriage going along a straight road. In the case of, and I don't necessarily even believe that's true, but it was nevertheless a saying. When it comes to Alexander II, it was more that these reforms were teetering over the edge and the carriage could slip at any moment, and as a result, the whole political project of Russia could collapse in its wake. And it seems that emancipation, one of these various reforms to deal with the peasant situation in Russia, to make it more economical, to improve basically public relations between the central government and the Russian peasant, all of these had left very, very mixed results. And Alexander III and Nicholas II are dealing with that aftermath and trying to resolve the, again, potential failings of Alexander II's reign. Tolstoy hoped that the very best people would volunteer their services to be land captains, and this was relatively without foundation. As early as November of 1889, the government abolished the secondary education requirements for land captains in order to attract a suitable number of gentry candidates. Such actions merely confirmed the public image of land captains as ignorant, arbitrary, and often lazy officials, basically recreating the problem but adding another level of intermediaries. Not surprisingly, such perceptions contributed significantly, along with the burden of Sergei Witta's policy, which Sergei Witta was the first quote-unquote prime minister of Russia. He was a leading minister in the last few years of Alexander III. He was arguably the leading voice for the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and thereby obviously of mobility for the peasantry, and sponsorship of an overlooked factor of later Tsarist Russia, which is industrialization. That, of course, a byproduct of emancipation is that Russia could have more manpower to funnel into various cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kharkov, Kiev, and other industrial centers. Witta's policy of rapid industrialization placed the peasantry to a rural crisis at the turn of the century, which ultimately engulfed the imperial government in 1917. With Nicholas II, the last Tsar, we have the so-called Stolypin reform. We have the revolution of 1905 and 1906, and then the appointment of Stolypin, the quote-unquote hangman, who had been the most effective from the point of view of the Tsar, the governor, in dealing with stability and order within his province, and so he was promoted. Stolypin was responding in his attempts to reform agriculture to the overlooked agrarian uprisings during the revolution of 1905. His reform, the Stolypin reform, was aimed at expanding outright private ownership of farmland, combined with an emphasis on peasant cooperatives. In other words, we want kulaks, we want individual gentry farmers, yet we also want to ensure that the mirs still exist. We don't want to get rid of the communal ethos if there is still, again, this idea among the Russian elites of the dark race or the black hundreds or whatever. These communal entities, these, again, more backward configurations of society, we are not going to have a monolithic, uniform version of society like a French Revolution imposing everything on above. We are going to have gradations of society. We are going to have certain groups of people left to their own devices to form a system or society which mimics something which is much older, ancient, going back to medieval Russia, while at the same time we need an expression within agriculture which can bear close resemblance, say, for example, to what exists in Western Europe. The cultivated, educated Western farmer. Stolypin wanted to appeal to both archetypes. And in this was the argument around something called the kultur. It was promoted as an alternative, these cooperatives, to large noble estates. In other words, Stolypin was earnestly dealing with the aftermath of the Emancipation and trying to make it work, as had Dmitry Tolstoy and as had Alexander II and Kobylev and Solomon and all of these other officials before. Indeed, if you look at the peasant cooperatives and you're trying to find some link between Stalin and Lenin and pre-sort of Tsarist Russia, pre-communist Tsarist Russia, then Stolypin's cooperatives were, you can say, the holdover of this policy. One of the last great hurrahs in affirming the identity, the relationship between the Tsar and the peasant was through the tricentenary celebrations of the Romanovs in 1913, 300 years of Romanov rule. We have the glorification of Ivan Susanin, the peasant who saves the life of the Tsar in Glinka's famous opera, My Life for the Tsar, which was played over and over and over again. And as far as I'm aware, that is also during the performance where Sergei Stolypin was assassinated for various conspiracies are attached to the impetus behind his assassination. Either it was a left-wing revolutionary, but a large sector of opinion alludes to this idea that Stolypin was in fact murdered by elements of the landed gentry, that they believed Stolypin was too radical a reformer and that he would effectively undo the legacy of Russia's landed estates as had existed. Very interesting arguments, but again, they play around with this idea that post-emancipation, truly the situation of the Russian peasant had moved on, you can say, radically from the situation that had existed in 1861. And there were many, again, avenues from which quote-unquote Russian emancipation could evolve, whether it was going to be the expansion of the yeomanry farmer, or indeed trying to make these successful cooperatives, which have so much in terms of the fidelity to the mir, the peasant society, all of these things. Again, look at Russia as a society of gradations and not a single sort of uniform French Revolutionary style up sort of a downward diktat informing all of these policies. On the one hand, you can say, for example, look at the land captains of Dmitry Tolstoy and say, oh, these are very similar to the Intendants in France, as so much of reform in Russia was based on French reforms, and in particular Second Empire, Napoleon III reforms. Yet at the same time, you can say that these positions are voluntary. They were more complicated than that, and there were no system of département, rather these loose governorships, which again had degrees of autonomy over which they presided. So more convoluted, more complicated, and ultimately Russia is a unique case. Liberals had intensely, therefore, engaged with the idea of the political affiliation of the Russian peasantry at the beginning of the revolution. But primarily the Marxist conception of the peasantry was that they were a reactionary throwback. And perhaps the situation in Russia and the Black Hundreds during the 1905 revolution confirmed this view to somewhat. And that's also an opinion which has followed Lenin. Nevertheless, Lenin would declare in 1905, at the time of the revolution, that the time has now come when the peasantry is coming forward as a conscious maker of a new way of life in Russia. The course and outcome of the Great Russian Revolution depend in tremendous measure on the growth of the peasants' political consciousness. In other words, it's not enough to look to classical Marxist understanding, which is to say that the engine of the revolution will primarily be in Western Europe, industrialized, urbanized societies, and it will be the industrial laboring classes in the cities, it will be the proletariat, as the Marxists identify, who will lead the revolutionary charge. No, if we are to bring about revolution in Russia, the conditions will be different, and the peasantry must be aware and be made aware, basically, of a political identity, a political consciousness which supersedes their connection towards Tsarism. In terms of understanding the significance of Lenin in many, many ways, one of the most crucial ways to understand Lenin's significance is in speeding along the course of quote-unquote Marxist history, applying will, agency, and ensuring that when the communist revolution happens, it occurs in a country where it was basically not supposed to happen, which is Russia, as opposed to Germany, France, or England, which had conditions which were far more conducive to Marxist analysis. And again, this flexible understanding about the need to appeal to the peasants, I would argue rather cynically, informs this view and bleeds into our understanding of how the Russians, how the Soviets, how Stalin would deal with the condition of the peasants. We had the First World War. The First World War goes very badly for Russia. We had the Russian Revolution in 1917. The First Revolution in March deposes the Tsar, establishes a weak diarchy between a provisional government and a workers' council or a Soviet, basically more or less consisted of the working classes, but also army regiments, the Preobrazhensky regiment, for example, in Petrograd. This leads to a condition where the central authority is very weak. They commit to continuing the war, which goes badly, and so in November of 1917, October by the old Russian calendar, to make it all the more confusing, the Bolsheviks commit a coup against a more or less, again, rudderless and constituency-less Russian government and declare all power to the Soviets. In the ensuing civil war, we see Russia sort of bypassing, the communists bypassing the first mass elections in Russia, which gave power to their rivals, the social revolutionaries, who you can say were far more in deference to political activism from the communities, the Hododnas or political associations of the peasants. No, the communist movement, the Bolshevik movement, was far more associated with the cities and with the army, and it really became a matter of conscripting all forms of life, all segments of Russian society into the Red Army, yet also rigorously persecuting and eliminating others. Cossacks, for example, were side by side with the peasantry in Russia. They were the exemplars of this argument of having a vertical relationship to the Tsar. But in the case of the Cossacks, they were able to retain their own forms of living, their own societies, in return for providing great military service, and they provided that role in the First World War. Because of that, they were the objects of decossacization during the Russian Civil War. We have the Green Armies, which were sprouting up, again, in support of the social revolutionaries and attempting to have a middle way, you can say, between Bolshevism and the, again, more Tsarist white armies, who were themselves crushed and defeated by the Bolsheviks. So by the time we get to 1922, the Bolsheviks have effectively won the Russian Civil War and have fought wars with other neighboring European powers to establish the Soviet Union. So we come to the impetus behind collectivization, and a rather, again, interesting way of interpreting it, which is Lenin and whether we see Lenin and Stalinism as continuing on from each other, or whether we see Lenin actually acting more in the spirit of the Stolypin reform with the peasant cooperatives, and that it is in fact Stalin who is this dramatic aberration. So Evel Economakis says this: in 1921, Lenin presented the small commodity producers cooperatives as an example of what he meant by estate capitalism. This is him ostensibly going back from the tenets of hardcore socialism or war communism, as Trotsky would define it, mobilizing all the resources of the state in order to fight the war, but rather returning to the principles of limited land ownership, private property, one step backwards in order to achieve two steps forwards. Basically, this is all the argumentation and the logic that was going around, but also to prevent massive famine and from the Russian economy to prevent it collapsing. At that time, production was at the center of his interest in the cooperative movement. The transition from the small proprietor cooperatives to socialism is the transition from small-scale to large-scale production. The cooperative policy, if successful, will facilitate the transition within an indefinite period to large-scale production based on voluntary association. In other words, what Lenin is doing is that he sees the Stolypin reform, the peasant cooperatives, as leading to long-term historical conditions where you could see larger farms, which again, from a reactionary point of view, from looking at the Russian Slavophiles, you can say building up these larger scale units of production voluntarily would actually be the greatest affirmation of these peasant society, these peasant communities. But from the point of view of the communists, building an identity around a socialist political consciousness, that would be the dream. But you can say there is a root of old Russian thinking which undergirds it, which again means that what I said at the early section of the stream, Marxism imported from the West with Russian characteristics, this you can say is an example of that. If in 1921 Lenin considered large-scale production to be a task for the cooperative's future, by January 1923, this is after he suffered a series of debilitating strokes, for reference he'll die the next year, he had apparently discovered a socialist potential for cooperatives. In his article on cooperatives, he is suggesting that the existing cooperatives, which were primarily engaged in the buying and selling of agricultural produce, tools and implements, and in the provision of cheap credit, which was another key aspect of the Stolypin reform, were important as they were from the standpoint of a transition to a new system, the simplest, easiest, and the most acceptable for the peasants. Importantly, Lenin did not insist that cooperatives had to be large, production-oriented units in order to be included in the socialist endeavor. In other words, again, he was flexible in terms of playing with these economic ideas. In the historical literature, however, of the Stalin period, Lenin's cooperative plan was identified with a break rather, and Stalin's basically, his collectivization was representing a break with this policy, with the new economic policy, which is identified with Lenin, which is what he basically describes as state capitalism, as the gradual voluntary expansion of these small cooperatives into larger scale units, which will make them more productive. The approach employed by Soviet historians in the early mid-60s, so for example, this would have been during the time of Khrushchev and early Brezhnev, in studying the social structure of the village and its transformation in the 1930s was impressive. Again, this is a talk about Soviet historiography, not Western historiography. Historians balanced factors promoting the development of agriculture with factors retarding this development. Naturally, the positive effects of the October Revolution were always mentioned, including the abolition of the Land Code of 1922, of private property in land, an action which freed the peasant from the average 700 million ruble annual expenditure for land purchases prior to the revolution. These funds were now free to be used for agricultural improvements. It was also observed that the state farms, the so-called Zogzodzi, and the first Kolkhozy, were established on landed noble estates. In other words, from the point of view of the socialists, this represented positive land reform. However, the negative results of this black repatriation of 1917, the splitting up of the noble estates, of most noble estates, was stressed. Importantly, a sharp increase in the number of peasant households during the first decade of the Soviet power was observed, from 21 million in 1916, that's during the height of the war, to approximately 25 million in 1927. The increase resulted in a general levelling of peasant households, a marked depolarisation of the process set into motion by Stolypin during his land reforms post-1906. The middle peasant, the so-called Seladniak, again became the central figure in the countryside, and the backward, three-field system of crop rotation was revived where it had ceased to hold sway. This meant that the kulak and the poor peasant, the bedniak, were no longer as widespread. According to Danilov, the percentage of peasant households not possessing sowing land in European Russia in 1920 declined in comparison with 1917 from 10% to 5%, and the percentage of well-off households declined from 5% to 0.5%. The irony here is that Soviet historiography, acting in the Khrushchev and the Brezhnev era, has not established the kulak, the wealthy peasant, as this incontestable enemy of the peasant, and therefore a justified object of class struggle from the Marxist point of view. If such a radical measure, dekulakization, could be justified as anything other than a radical intensification and deviation of Leninist policy. What we see with Lenin, again, is the proliferation of, you could say, the sub-kulak, the middle peasant, the Seledniak. And from the point of view, again, of the peasants, the dispossession of the noble estates, the elimination of much of the debt that was owed to the nobles. Yes, in the short term, it provides a great boon, yet at the same time, you can say the Soviet economy, the developments in agriculture have not advanced to what we'd later see with the quote-unquote needs of Stalin and rapid industrialization. So how do we understand Stalin as a revolutionary trajectory, his perspective, and consider this versus the trajectory of scientific Marxism? In other words, all of these developments as evolutionary versus Stalin and his emphasis on will. Stalin in 1947, again regarding reform within the Soviet economy, said this, that there are no fortresses that Bolsheviks cannot storm. There could be no justification for references to so-called objective conditions, and that would be referring to economic determinism. The part played by so-called objective conditions has been reduced to a minimum, whereas the part played by our organizationals and their leaders has become decisive, exceptional. In other words, individual will, revolutionary action, agitators. This would actually continue on in the Leninist trajectory in terms of the emphasis on the vanguard, these elite permanent professional revolutionaries leading the people rather than simply being the agents of mass political movements. No, Stalin is a once intensifying elements of Leninism, but you can say expanding it far beyond. You can say Lenin's more limited goals when it comes to the field of agriculture. Emphasis on no fortresses that Bolsheviks cannot storm. We all see this with the effects of dekulakization, the transformation of nature, the transformation of agriculture, that so long as will is applied and we adhere to our revolutionary and our Marxist scientific scruples, there's nothing that we cannot achieve. During the period from 1936 to 1953, collectivization was attributed to Stalin. As Khrushchev himself said a few years before Stalin died, socialism was victorious in our country because the peasantry secured the wherewithal to make a change to a socialist construction, and for this we are indebted to the collective farm system of which Stalin was the founder. The Khrushchev thaw and the need to justify the continued presence of collective farms. So what happens is that Stalin dies in 1953. In 1956, there is the so-called secret speech, which allows for increased criticism of Stalin, and in some cases a full repudiation of Stalin's legacy, even to the extent that statues of Stalin are removed, and we see Stalingrad change its name to Volgograd and Stalino changing its name, etc. So this was actually quite radical, but nevertheless, Stalin, if he is the author of the collective farm system, it's not the work of Lenin, but the work of Stalin, albeit you can argue that this was a radical increase of, what Leninism was supposed to represent, hence why I alluded to earlier. Is it an intensification or is it a deviation? You still have collective farms in the Soviet Union. So to justify their continued presence, their existence, Stalin and his association with collectivization was changed. Instead, Lenin was ascribed as a primary influence in anticipating this policy. Again, this is the idea of returning within Marxist historiography to orthodoxy, that these things were inevitable. They represented a trajectory upon which all socialist societies will basically evolve. And this is what I'm going to call, again, it's a predictive model of development, and from the Marxists again, based on scientific principles, which in turn, the affirmation of this further bolsters the legitimacy of the Marxist and the Leninist models while de-emphasizing Stalin in the process. And ironically, it was actually Stalin himself that had begun, you can say, this turn during the 19th Party Congress in 1952, a year before his death. Reference is made to the specific role of the Soviet government in building socialism, which allegedly enables it existing laws of economic development and to form new ones. This is untrue. That collectivization was undoubtedly a difficult, complex, and unprecedented task. Nevertheless, the Soviet government accomplished it not because it supposedly destroyed the existing economic laws and formed new ones, but only because it relied on the economic law that the relations of production must necessarily conform with the character of productive forces. During the pre-Gorbachev era, so this is before 1985, historians were compelled to show continuity between the commercial and the trade cooperatives, which predominated the countryside until 1929 before decolonization, and the collective farm set up after 1929. This was dictated not only by the rediscovery by Stalin in the early 1950s of the importance of the base and of the regularities of historical evolution, but also of the need to associate Lenin with everything that occurred under Stalin. Unable to demonstrate continuity, historians writing after 1956 noted that the simplest types of cooperative organization served as schools for educating the peasants to the advantages of higher productive forms of cooperation. How the peasant put this education into practice was not explained. In fact, the complaint was made that the organizational role not only of the pre-1929 trade and commercial cooperatives, but also of these old kolkhozes, which presumably served as strong points for collectivization, was not clarified. It was not until very recently that historians had begun to criticize any connection between the simple cooperatives and the collective farm movement, no longer constrained by the need to present collectivization as a necessary, rational decision, which had the support of a majority of peasants. Historians today agree that agricultural cooperatives were actually liquidated during the collectivization drive, and they had ceased completely to exist in the winter of 1931 to 1932. In other words, if Lenin was advocating a policy towards, you can say, a continuity of the late Tsarist regime, the trajectory of figures like, again, Dmitry Tolstoy and Stolypin, Stalin upended this and completely eradicated this policy. And in order to understand this, I think it's important to actually read from Stalin himself. This was an article he had written, or rather a proclamation he had made in Pravda, the communist newspaper, on November the 7th, 1929, just a month before decolonization. The past year was a year of great change in all fronts of socialist construction. The keynote of this change has been and continues to be determined offensive of socialism against the capitalist elements in town and country. The characteristic feature of this offensive is that it has already brought us to a number of definitive, decisive successes in the principal spheres of socialist reconstruction of our national economy. We may therefore conclude that our party succeeded in making good use of our retreat during the first stages of the new economic policy, in other words, retreating back to state capitalism and private enterprise, in the subsequent stages to organize the change and to launch a successful offensive against the capitalist elements. When the new economic policy was introduced, Lenin said, We are now retreating, going back as it were, but we are doing this in order, by retreating, first, afterwards, to take a run and make a more powerful leap forward. It was on this first condition alone that we are retreating to pursuing our policy, a new economic policy, in order to start a most persistent advance after our retreat. The result of the past year show beyond no doubt that it is in this work, that the party is successfully carrying out the decisive directive of Lenin's. And you can take this sincerely, that Stalin is continuing in Lenin's trajectory, and I believe an argument can therefore be made, but it's to what extent and to what sort of level of radicalism that Stalin has committed himself about upturning, you can say, the more gradualist policies of an indefinite transition and voluntary change from the cooperatives to larger forms of mass farming. There can scarcely be any doubt that one of the most important facts in our work of construction during the past year is that we have succeeded in bringing about a decisive change in the sphere of productivity of labour. This change has found expression in the growth of the creative initiative and intense labour enthusiasm of the vast masses of the working classes on the front of socialist construction. This is our first fundamental achievement of the past year. In the fight by means of self-criticism against bureaucracy, which shackles the labour initiative and labour activity of the masses. Now this is vital. Stalin and his, you can say, conquest of power vis-a-vis Trotsky is often seen as a bureaucratic revolution against the great man in the form of Trotsky. First of all, Stalin forms a quote-unquote triumvirate or troika with other socialists, Kamenev and Zinoviev. And then he uses his position as head of the machinery of the Communist Party, as the rather innocuous title of General Secretary attests to, in order to lead a bureaucratic revolution against other members, basically of Sovnarkom and the Politburo, in order to ensure more or less autocratic power. But this argument against bureaucracy, it's consistent throughout many, many socialist writers. It's only, you can say, a rather strange offset of communists who believe that bureaucratic organizations can be the engine of revolutionary change. No, the official position is that obviously the peasant has to be the engine of revolutionary change, and by extension the party as representing the peasant, the proletariat, the working labouring classes of the Soviet Union. So any notion that these are being led by bureaucratic officials, apparatchiks, is actually counter-revolutionary in a sense. So as many Slavophile writers were contesting with this idea, they were seeing bureaucracy as a foreign intervention in Russian state affairs, a process of alienation. So by that same logic, from the point of view of doctrinaire socialists, bureaucracy, from the very words of Stalin himself, would actually represent a counter-revolutionary impetus. We need to fight against bureaucracy in order that these new collective farms, they express voluntary association, spontaneous mass movements. These are not the result of officials in Moscow trying to drive up quotas and trying to corral these people in order to control them more effectively. No, it's an anti-bureaucratic revolution. Continuing on with Stalin, in the fight by means of socialist emulation against the labour shirkers and disruptors of proletarian labour discipline. Again, you can see in this with socialist emulation perhaps a analogue with the land captains reform in the later Tsarist period, which is the fear that under the abolition of serfdom, labour quotas are going downhill. So again, perhaps a recreation of the conditions of serfdom, of directed labour, would ensure higher quotas and diminish again the prospect for economic sabotage. All of these arguments, what I find interesting in terms of stressing all of this together, and something I rarely see, is that I'm denoting the continuities in systems between ideologically incompatible regimes, ostensibly, how the fight against bureaucracy is a Slavophile argument, and how socialist emulation here of trying to bring about labour discipline is in accordance with the defenders of serfdom itself. In the sphere of agriculture, by I am referring to Stalin, I am referring to the radical change in the development of our agriculture from small, backward individual farming to large-scale advanced collective agriculture. to joint cultivation of the land, to machine and tractor stations, to artels, collective farms based on modern techniques, and finally to a giant state-equipped farm equipped with hundreds of tractors and harvester combines. Again, the impetus behind collectivization is modernization. We want to make farming more efficient in order to serve again the needs of the industrialized society, which again is Stalin's great achievement, the creation of the heavily industrialized Soviet society, which is able again to build up in order to create one of the most terrifying war engines that we see in the 1940s. That again, people therefore attest that there has been an improvement in the scale of agriculture, but it comes at the expense of the individual farmer. This is the reactionary throwback. He is at odds with the spirit of modernization, and I cannot again but help but feel that this goes back to Tolstoy and the arguments that were actually presented within Anna Karenina itself. The party's achievements consist in the fact that in a whole number of areas we have succeeded in turning the main mass of the peasantry away from the old capitalist path of development, which benefits only a small group of the rich, while the vast majority of the peasants are doomed to ruin and utter poverty, to the new socialist path of development, which ousts the rich and capitalists, re-equips the middle and the poor peasants along new lines, equipping them with modern implements, tractors, agricultural machinery, so as to enable them to climb out of poverty and enslavement to the kulaks on the high road of cooperative, collective cultivation of the land. All of these arguments, all of these revolutionary arguments are made from the point of view of peasant emancipation, whereas, again, cynically, you have to look at this in terms of rejigging the relationship between the peasant and his role with the state. The achievement of the party, of the Communist Party, consists in the fact that we have succeeded in bringing about this radical change deep down in the peasantry itself, and in securing the following of the broad masses of the poor and the middle peasants, in spite of incredible difficulties, in spite of desperate resistance of retrograde forces of every kind, from kulaks, priests, to philistines, and right opportunists. It must be admitted that such an impetuous speed of development is unequalled, even by our socialized large-scale industry, which is generally marked by the outstanding speed of its development. It is clear that our young large-scale industry, our socialist agriculture, has a great future beyond it, and its development will be truly miraculous. Again, that's rather unfortunate wording. This unprecedented success in agricultural development is due to the fact that the Soviet government correctly recognized the growing needs of the peasant for new implements, for modern techniques. It correctly recognized that the old forms of cultivation leave the peasantry in a hopeless position, and taking all this into account, it came to their aid in good time by organizing machine hiring stations, tractor columns, machine and tractor stations, organizing collective cultivation of the land, establishing collective farms, and finally by having the state farms give every assistance to peasant farming. Collapsed and crumbled to dust have the assertions of our opposition, Bukharin, the right opportunists, basically you can say the main sort of critics of collectivization. Their arguments being that the peasants would not join the collective farms, that the accelerated development of collective farms would only cause discontent and estrangement between the peasantry and the working classes, that the high road of socialist development in the country is not the collective of collective farms, but of the cooperatives, in other words, following on Lenin's policy, that the development of the collective farms and the offensive against the capitalist elements in the countryside might deprive the country of grain altogether. All those arguments have crumbled to dust as old bourgeois liberal rubbish. At the same time, Stalin is saying that this is effectively a voluntary association. This is a revolutionary movement which is to the benefit of the peasants. The only people who have to fear are those retrograde elements who are basically stifling not only modernization and industry, but also the economic welfare of the middle and lower peasants, again to use that language. And the state, insofar as it intervenes at all in this process, only does so to help the peasant, to give them the tools they need, to give them the means to cultivate the land. And conversely, those who oppose this plan, because again, this is written basically as a what Stalin is doing is that he's stealing much of the arguments and the intellectual impetus behind the left faction within Stalin, within Marxism and the Soviet Union, led by figures like Trotsky, which was to lead for this process of aggressive collectivization, while using it as an argument against the more moderate economic reformists, those advocating for the continuation of the new economic policy, Bukharin. And I just want to repeat it because it's worth noting the arguments that the peasants would not join the collective farms, that collective farms would not cause mass discontent, that the cooperatives were a better mode of development, that the collective farm might deprive the country of grain altogether. The fact that Stalin so triumphantly declares that all those arguments have collapsed and crumbled to dust as old bourgeois liberal rubbish not only identifies that he's completely aware of the pitfalls, but in this case he is completely gaslighting everyone in terms of what later occurs. And I'm going to explain this through, again, using two historians, Massimo Livi-Bacci on the human costs of collectivization first. The chain of events leading to famine in the Soviet Union is well documented, and there is considerable agreement among historians on the subject. The crisis had its origins at the end of the new economic policy and in the Great Turn in 1929 to undertake an ambitious plan of rapid industrialization, which then greatly accelerated the process of urbanization during the first five-year national plan. Income, industrial production, and investment were supposed to multiply by a factor of 2 or 3, while consumption was supposed to increase. Industrial workers and urban dwellers, the protagonists of this incredible effort, had to be fed, hence a new system of grain procurement was enacted. In economic terms, this meant turning the terms of trade against the peasant in order to subsidize urban dwellers, consumption and increase industrial development. Emigration of unskilled labor from the countryside into the cities also increased because of higher relative urban wages. During the first five-year plan alone, the cities grew by 44%, and the salaried labor force more than doubled, growing from 10 to 23 million. Migration to the cities averaged 1.1 million a year from 1926 and increased to 3 million a year in 1930. This is from Danilov, a historian previously cited. This process brought about a dramatic deterioration in the standard of living for the rural populations and no improvement for the urban. During the new economic policy, procurement had been based on commercial operations, but the program encountered increasing difficulties as peasants kept grain for their own consumption and preferred to sell the government industrial crops or cattle, for which the compensation would be higher. The grain procurement of around 11 million tons, or about 15% of total production, was not enough to feed growing non-farm populations. Rationing of consumers in cities was initially introduced gradually during 1928 in some areas, and it became general in 1929, perhaps the first and only recorded instance of the introduction of rationing in times of peace. Extracting grain from millions of recalcitrant farmers was a difficult task even for the Soviet regime. Two momentous decisions were taken in the fall of 1929, both aiming, among other things, to facilitate this procurement: the liquidation of the kulaks, or the rich peasants, who were seemed enemies of the revolution and of socialism, and the general collectivization of agriculture. Both decisions had tragic consequences. The liquidation of the kulaks took place in three waves, beginning at the end of 1929 and ending 3 years later, if we accept Molotov's estimate of 1.3 to 1.5 million kulaks. Households, I should say, as opposed to 7 million persons. Then, total expropriations of landholding, homesteads must have exceeded that number because other categories of peasants were also affected. It concludes that several million households, a total of 10 million persons or more, could have been deported, of whom a great many must have perished. Robert Conquest, the historian, affirms that estimates are that a quarter to a third of these deportees may have perished in the exhausting travels, often on foot, owing to the hardships of work camps and as a result of cold, hunger, or violence. In addition to the demographic loss, one has to add the loss of human capital. Better off than the average peasants, the kulaks were also generally more efficient agricultural producers. The drive to feed an expanding industrial workforce and a swelling urban population, by extracting grain from millions of unwilling farmers encountered increasing difficulties. Collectivization had the advantage of concentrating farmers in a reduced number of large producing units that were more easily controlled, and its fulfillment of a strategic objective as well as an ideological one. The process of collectivization was brutally accelerated at the end of 1929. The beginning of March 1930, some 58 peasants of peasant households were organized into collectives. The peasants resisted by slaughtering cattle, selling their stocks and implements, and refusing to plant. The policy was relaxed. Peasants left the collectives, the kolkhozoi, by the millions, and by July of 1930, their proportion in the collectives had fallen to 24%. The collectivization process resumed at the end of that year. By mid-1931, collectives claimed 53% of farmers and 67% of present crop areas. 4 years later, these proportions had grown, so this is 1935, to 83% and 94%. Peasants outside of the kolkhoz were given inferior land and were loaded with extra taxes and delivery obligations. In many ways, actually, you can see this as a return to the financial racketeering that we see with serfdom. Always why it's important to understand serfdom as a degree of regulations and bondages. If anything, that relationship, the collectivization of labor, seeing it as a ideologically cohesive and also strategically managed unit, while penalizing those who wanted to exist outside of the system with potentially ruinous taxes and limited mobility, etc. All of this seems to actually be alluding to the earlier framework of serfdom that we see in the 17th century, serfdom to serfdom. Decolonization and collectivization provided the framework for grain procurement. After the successful harvest of 1930, procurement was stepped up to 22 million tons from the 17 million tons the preceding year. Even the more ambitious plans for 1931 were advanced based on exaggerated estimates of production. Procurement quotas were achieved through oppression and violence. Even fodder and seeds were confiscated from the many kolkhozoi. Procurement quotas were increased to a fantastic level of 39 million tons for 1932, then subsequently reduced to 18 million tons. In the meantime, the totally cropped areas had diminished due to disorganization of the collective farms and the hostility of the peasants. But what was this hostility? I began this talk by emphasizing that the peasant rebellion figures little into this narrative. I've already alluded to it various times, the threat of it, and indeed elements of it during the 1905 revolution, this following on from a famine that we see during the late reign of Alexander III. But it is that we are dealing with the concept of revolution which is primarily from above, whether it be Alexander II's emancipation, or simultaneously, whether it be Stalin's dekolonization and his desire to force everyone onto the kolkhozoi while presenting it as a voluntary association. So if we look at Stalin and other Tsarist figures as basically being the agents of history in this case, what agency can we ascribe to the peasants during Stalin's rule? And as historian Tracy McDonald points out, there is this interesting case of the completely overlooked Pitelinskii uprising. The Pitelinskii district is located about 100 miles due east of the city of Riazan, which is located 125 miles southeast of Moscow. In 1929, Riazan province had a population of almost 2 million people. In 1930, the province became a so-called okrug within the newly formed Moscow region. Riazan and its county were subdivided into smaller administrative units or rayons. Pitelinskii, its district, was one of the smaller of Ryazan's 27 districts. It was about 1,000 square kilometers in size, with one village or rural district located every 32 square kilometers on average. The district was characterized by a fairly high population density. 23,000 men and 26,000 women lived in this district, virtually all classified as rural inhabitants rather than migration workers or town dwellers, again for lack of a better word, peasant. From January, the relationship between collectivizers and the local peasantry in the district was tense, as events moved relentlessly towards a violent confrontation. On the 22nd of February, peasants from across the district began to gather on the narrow streets of the village of Evel. Early in the day, rumours circulated to the effect that the Collectivization Brigade and the Soviet, the Soviet sort of advance guard, were gathering cattle to slaughter and ship all to Moscow. Over the course of the day, more and more peasants filed through the village streets. One version of events later claimed that brigade members had seized cattle to be redistributed to poorer peasants. The gathered cattle escaped, and when the brigade members were chasing after the beasts, a crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. Members went chasing after the beasts. A second version of events claimed that the problems in Veyevel occurred due to the tactless conduct of the plenipotentiaries involved in the collectivization work. Furthermore, the unrest did not involve cattle, but rather the collectivization of seed grain. Whatever the case may be, there is no doubt that the brigade of the Zelsovet members were indeed tactless. They went from door to door in the villages of the district and emptied the barns, most belonging to the middle peasants, of all remaining grain. 30 of these middle peasants were then fined for not contributing to the grain reservation collection. Brigade members and the Soviet officials combed the homes of villagers in their relentless search for the hidden grain, even breaking open the locked trunks in which peasant families kept their most treasured possessions. The collectivizers seized not only grain reserved for the next planting season, but baked bread, which they often took by force. When women, the brigade members, dragged them around by their braids. According to one report, the local Selsovet told peasants that they had 24 hours to turn over their grain. Those who failed to do so will be subject to fines and searches. Locks were broken on storehouses, which were then picked clean. The report went on to note that livestock was collectivized without adequate preparation, and with no thought given to shelter or to fodder. Moreover, during decollectization, a significant number of middle peasants and the families of Red Army soldiers were stripped of virtually everything and left standing, quite literally, in their underclothes. By the 22nd of February, the villagers of Veyevel had had enough and chased the collectivizers out of the village. The collectivizers ran towards the neighboring village of Gridino, but the peasants of Veyevel rang the church bells to alert their Gridino neighbors, leading to the gathering of a massive crowd in the village as well. Part of the Veyevel crowd chased after the fleeing collectivizers, while the remaining villagers destroyed the barn in which the confiscated seed grain had been stored. The crowd then broke through the windows at the Selsovet and smashed whatever they could find in the building. They seized property which had been stripped from the peasants, labelled as kulaks, and dispossessed, returning it to its owners. The crowd then proceeded to beat Selsovet chairman and the wife of a party member for good measure. The disturbance lasted until 5 or 6 in the evening. Meanwhile, in the village of Glidino, the church bells summoned a crowd twice the size of the one gathered in Veyevel. The crowd beat one brigade member severely and chased the remaining members of the collectivization brigade on the village of Pavlivka. Both villages settled down in the evening, but throughout the night, small groups of local peasants patrolled Veyevel. In fact, for 4 days, the peasants of Veyevel staffed checkpoints and barricades and refused to allow the officials into the village until they had agreed to address the issues of violations, excesses, and scandalous behaviour of the brigade and the Soviet members. Whenever officials approached the village, the church bells in Veyevel ran out, and the peasants of Glidino came running. Peasants in the surrounding villages expressed their solidarity with these villagers. Already on the evening of the 22nd of February, for example, in the village of Andalivka, located around 5 miles from Glidino, a crowd marched through the village holding a black flag, again the flag of the peasantry. With rebellion threatening the entire district, an armed detachment to deal with the unrest was formed in the neighbouring district of Sazavo, comprised of members of the railway security forces. The force was dispatched to the Pitelinskii district under the leadership of the secretary of the district party committee and the chairman of the district Soviet executive committee. On the morning of the 23rd, the detachment arrived in Veyevel, which was calm. Within moments of the detachment's arrival, however, a crowd of women gathered. When 3 of the officers decided to look for the local cooperative store to find food, the women blocked their path. The officers responded by firing 5 shots into the air. With that, the church bells rang out, and a part of the crowd rushed towards the shots. the remaining peasants demanded that the detachment lay down its weapons or leave the village immediately. The secretary of the party committee and the chairman took fright and quickly retreated to Gridino. In Gridino, the bells had already summoned a crowd which attempted to detain the remaining officials, stopping their horses and throwing sticks at them. The detachment then withdrew to the district centre at Pitelinskii. In response to the bells in the villages, a crowd of several thousand peasants coalesced in Vialevo from at least 10 surrounding villages, including Malivka, Antilivka, Fem, Mikhailovka, Dmitrievka, Pavlivka, Sinikino, and Lubanos. According to a report, the Vialevo priest had played an active role in the unrest, shouting, "Stand up for the Orthodox faith," from the church steps. This again should be noted that these are all the quintessential reactionary and regressive elements that Stalin had denounced in his speech 3 months before. On the 23rd of February at 11 p.m., villagers called a general meeting at Gridino, which was attended by more than 300 people, mainly women. At the meeting, the women demanded that the chairman of the district Soviet Executive Committee, the Serfdom, and his assistants be put on trial for the next 48 hours. The women threatened to hang these officials on meat hooks if they fell into their hands. They also demanded the return of their recently socialized grain reserves, noting that the grain was simply rotting in its current storage conditions. At the end of the meeting, the villagers resolved to elect a new Selssovet immediately and to launch an investigation into the excesses of the collectivization drive. It is worth noting that the villagers themselves recognized the pivotal role of the Soviet workers' councils and sought re-election in order to promote and protect their interests. For the next few days, the villagers undid collectivization. On the night of the 23rd, the village of Firm, a group of women warned that the former head of the district Soviet Executive Committee that they intended to turn back their grain reserves. At midnight, a crowd of 100 strong, including peasants from the neighbouring villages of Rusnovka and Sukashka, arrived to seize the grain reserves. At the same time, in the village of Stanisha, a crowd of women destroyed the communal holdings for collectivized cattle and beat the local agronomist, while in the village of Abkuvka, peasants rallied to prevent the dispossession and decolonization of their members. In other words, we see a vast series of moments of unrest throughout this period. The grain crisis, so called from the point of view of the officials in these villages, continues from February until May until June. Many of the local officials are effectively scapegoated, and as we can plainly see, collectivization, indeed the methods of collectivization, disappropriation, the destruction of agricultural goods and produce and the effects that this would have, the effects of bureaucratic officials and brigade members, security officials, and the implementation of these policies all rail against this idea, the happy sort of socialist idea that this is all spontaneous action, this is all voluntary action. Rather, this is again, in terms of looking at the trajectory of rebelling against bureaucracy, this is the bureaucratic revolution in motion, the revolution of quantity, that we need to have these ridiculous quotas. And of course, if these quotas are frustrated, it can only be as a result of misappropriation or indeed hoarding. And the only way to solve these issues is by discipline, proletarian discipline, send in the brigades and demand that the hoarders relinquish their farming goods and their seed. And if they don't, then they will be subject to reprisals. So moving on from this, going on to the notion of, again, the human costs of the hunger, which stem from the 1930s onwards, and Massimo Livi-Bacci. In the fall of 1932, hunger, which had already struck the Ukraine early in that year, had become widespread. The Great Catastrophe lasted until the harvest of the summer of 1933. The worst hit areas were the grain-producing areas of Ukraine and the northern Caucasus, targets of ruthless repression by the regime. It should also be noted that these areas also largely went over to the whites during the Russian Civil War, the non-communists. In normal times, these two areas produced 1/3 of the harvest of the Soviet Union and about 1/2 of the marked grain. Procurement quotas for Ukraine were much higher than average. In 1930, 32% of the harvest In 1931, 38%, leaving the rural population with around 250 pounds of grain per capita, half of the normal supply. In 1932, plans were stepped up to an unrealistic procurement quota of 45% of a harvest that had been much reduced by the adverse consequences of collectivization. In spite of spreading hunger and the rising death toll, every effort was made to enforce the fulfillment of these quotas. It proved impossible to collect what could not be freely given. Repression was intensified, forced appropriation of grain continued, relief was denied. To areas struck by the famine and emigration to adjoining Poland and Romania was prohibited. The hated internal passports of the Tsarist era were gradually reintroduced to stem migration into the cities, and peasants were denied the right to buy tickets to railway stations. The cost of these policies in terms of losses suffered was enormous. Seldom was any government to wreak such havoc in its own country. Demographic catastrophe of the magnitude of that in the Soviet Union in 1932 and 1933 had never before been concealed. Nevertheless, the Soviet regime endeavored to suppress the facts and largely succeeded, at least outside its borders. Mobility restrictions and censorship, travel restrictions on unfriendly foreign reporters, visits organized for credulous foreign personalities like Edward Heriot, upbeat official declarations, the discrediting of expatriate spokespersons and organizations, and the willing credulity of the Western world, and the falsification or suppression of statistics, all contributed to the concealment of one of the major catastrophes of the century. Perhaps again you've noted the horrific irony in this, in that this conversation, the denigration of serfdom, much of the impetus towards the abolition of serfdom, was formed of a extra-Russian idea, a French idea, and later a generally European idea, a socialist idea, born out of many sort of left-wing intellectuals and thinkers, notably Marxists. Socialism therefore led in many ways the cry for the emancipation of the labourer, but it also again foretold that the serf and the rural labourer was perhaps again in a better condition vis-a-vis the industrial labourer, the wage slave, or all the proletarian, or however you want to define them in terms of those categories. But if the West is looking to Russia as backward, as prone to famine, as having this regressive condition for the peasantry, what is now occurring in the 1930s during what we essentially now refer to as the Holodomor is that the West is deliberately choosing to accept the lie, the obfuscation, the dissembly, that we have now created the new conditions of serfdom, which in terms of all the categories of whether it be bondage to the land, the internal passport, or whether it be financial ruin and basically having to purchase rights in order to do anything, as we saw with the 17th century, and then the strict rules regarding serfdom, so-called strict, even though we see a vast amount of immigration in the latter half of the 17th century, the, again, so-called Code of the Serfs in 1649. What we see here is not emancipation, is the reversal of history. All these things have come back under a different ideological guise. The ideology of emancipation, of the voluntary association, what can actually be seen to be a continuation of many of the more idealistic and perhaps even naive Russian writers and, agrarian defenders of the Slavophiles. They have reached the worst nightmare, which is not only collectivization and serfdom, the negation of the rural community, the despoliation of the parish, of the local priest, of what Montesquieu referred to as the serf of the glebe, and the creation of a new form of society, which is a strategic and ideological, how best to describe it, basically a holding pattern, a pen, in terms of using language regarding livestock, a pen for the regime. And the West, rather than critiquing it, as they were critiquing the institution of serfdom from the 1740s onwards through a long genealogy of writers, is here defending it. This is the advent of the new. It's the praise of the new man, the transformation of society, the forces of criticism, social criticism, and socialist emulation, the transformation of nature. And yet, we have arrived at the post-Russian society, the universalized cosmopolitan society of the Soviet Union, and yet we have arrived at a situation where history has turned in a tragic doom loop, for lack of a better expression, and how again this all pertains to the recreation of the conditions of Tsarism. The emancipation of the peasant, the emancipation of the serf, is dependent essentially on the relationship that the peasant has to the central authority, and that can ebb and flow with sometimes dramatic results, whether it be under Michael or Alexis, Alexander II, or indeed, as we see, with Stalin. Thank you very much for listening. That's all I can really manage in terms of the capabilities of my voice for this evening. So if you do have any questions, I will answer them now, and I will get through the super chats while you have time to post your questions. Thank you everyone for listening. Rong Tao Wu for $10. Thank you very much. I had to deal with some pretty bad jaw pain that needed treatment, so I apologize for being very inactive for the past few weeks. I am packing stuff today, so hopefully you'll watch this with everyone else. And yes, you have been watching this, so thank you very much, Rong Tao Wu, who again says for $5. Rural Imeñas estates, which from a time of Ivan IV seem also something of a precursor to the direct relationship between the serf and the Tsar. Yes, what I think has been overlooked in terms of the academic literature is that part of the impetus for serfdom was to reward loyal boyars who were assisting with the system of the Oplichnina, or the division of the state of Russia. It goes back to the central idea that the state was involved in ensuring that peasants couldn't go from one lord to another, and so loyal lords were awarded with peasants, and disloyal lords were dispossessed of other peasants. And the best way to ensure that that system of loyalty was maintained was through the principles of serfdom, as basically established with Ivan IV and his terrorization campaign against the aristocrats. It follows in the same logic. It simply became, you can say, more formalized during his reign and in the aftermath, and during the reign of the first Romanovs. But yes, it's an interesting point to consider. Proserfdom for $20. Thank you very much. That's very generous. Thank you for your work as always, AM. The argument towards people being happier, being agrarian, rings similar to the primitivist ideas floating around and gaining traction in some places here in the States. Well, it's not something new. I think it's something almost perennial, that the agrarian society is the most reactionary society. And even Spengler talks about it as the city is the engine of history, the city is the engine of change. Because Russia had been mostly unchanged by the time of the 19th century, what change you do see is in these isolated pockets like St. Petersburg. It led to a lot of romantic writers trying to basically situate, what is the role of the state and the peasant, which is why Tolstoy, who is, you could say, generally quite a radical thinker in many ways, was prepared to deal with this topic of emancipation with such objectivity, as did many thinkers of his time. The tragedy of all of this, of course, is that as much as we have quote unquote agrarian utopianism, even socialist utopianism towards the village during this period of time, what better way to undo the horrors of proletarian labor than to return to the village, to return to paradise, as it were, that Stalin uproots and basically compels agriculture in its dwindling numbers and under these, authoritarian conditions to contribute to the creation of, you can say, the most successful and rapid industrialization in world history. That's what I meant in terms of Stalin competing this Dumark. Of course, I've gone over the historiography, basically identifying whether this was a deviation or an intensification. And I think, as Stalin himself was quoting Lenin, I don't believe that this is a strict deviation. I simply believe that the Soviet legacy has to grapple with this idea that it wanted a society of voluntary associations. Its propaganda portrayed this as a voluntary association, whereas the reality of it, of course, was forced. Rong Tao Wu again, thank you very much for $10. Got to go, but if I have time tonight, I will deliver the tyrannism and some other things I promised about. I've written on Discord tonight, if not tomorrow afternoon. Wish everyone a blessed day. We'll look forward to that on the Discord server. Wrong Tawu, thank you very much. Ambivalent Teacher for $7 Canadian. Thank you very much. Thank you. Apologise if I missed the part as I was cut out for a bit. But do you see Stolypin's reform as being able to prevent the revolution? No, I don't see it as being able to prevent the revolution because we have agrarian, you can say, uprisings and unrest during the course of the First World War. But the Russian Revolution, when it occurred, was basically, I would say, a revolution of the Duma and of the army. The army was the one basically to depose the Tsar. The army couldn't rely on discipline within its ranks, and had the army been loyal unconditionally to the Tsar, and had the Tsarist officers been able to maintain loyalty within the ranks, I think Russia could have survived the war. As to what would have happened after the war is essentially a different question. What I've actually been at pains to say is that Stolypin was in many ways the halfway house that we see between serfdom and the peasant cooperatives, which were taken up by the new economic policy. The difference, of course, is that Stolypin was pandering to both the idea of the cooperative and the kulak, whereas, of course, Lenin wanted to take one and abolish the other. In the case of Stalin, we see the radical dekulakization, which further intensified the situation of crisis and famine that we see during the 5-year plan. So the causes of the Russian Revolution are, far more complicated, and looking at it as a sort of agrarian offshoot in that way. You have to also look at the Russian Revolution as really a conquest, a reconquest of power from the cities, from Moscow and St. Petersburg, establishing again a new power relationship with the center, and seeing agriculture brought along with that, with the new economic policy, and then forced to conform to it with the policy of forced collectivization. It's all very interesting. Right. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I will see you again soon.